from Ireland, you'd think that everybody there is like really chalked up on and fully, versed in their own mythology, but it seems to be that that's not my experience. You have your subculture, sure, but in Ireland generally, people are so caught up in the Catholic, Protestant, conflicts and all of that political stuff, which is a very modern phenomena in Irish history. Even though we would say it started in 1690, it's still a very modern thing. The Celtic stuff is thousands of years, it predates that, and most Irish people couldn't really care less about it. You have your Trinity College intellectuals who study Gaelic and what have you, but in general it's not anymore, because of the British government and a lot of mind control involvement there. There's been people have really forgotten about their roots.
Mind control.
Yeah, well, the whole, if anyone studied the operation of the British in Ireland, how they labored to change Gaelic place names, as part of their conquest during the Elizabethan times, and there's a huge effort with the penal laws of the 1700s and what have you to really distance people. I mean, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, and today is St. Patrick's Day, so it's very, very, consequential that we're talking like this, and it was on another radio show in the Bay Area this morning, and, a lot of people don't realize that in Ireland, when people go there and visit, and they want to maybe go and visit their ancestors and what have you, and you go to these cottages, and everybody goes, oh, look at those quaint cottages with the lovely small doors and the lovely small windows. What a lot of tourists don't realize is that the reason why they had such small windows is because the British government taxed the air.
They taxed the air?
They taxed the air. It was illegal to pick up sticks for a fire on the Lord's land. You'd have your hands cut off. And it's known by historians that the so-called penal laws of Ireland were the single most punitive and oppressive rules on any conquered people. These are the penal laws of Ireland in the 1700s. So, it's a miracle that the Irish even kept any kind of sense of identity. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about that still proliferates, because when this Catholic idea of St. Patrick coming and the Christian hegemony, these are just facts. When this Christian hegemony was sort of superimposed on the old Celtic religion, it had absolutely catastrophic, consequences on the culture of that country. So in modern days, especially when you're growing up young, like I did in Belfast, you have the devil of a time avoiding paramilitary, association or sectarian violence. All my friends, so-called, or the people that I went to school with, are either dead and they're in jail, and that's not, it's something like maybe your black community here would understand, but a lot worse, of course. And then what has happened in this country, you're visited by the troubles at, 9/11 with the Twin Towers, and I have to say it, that as tragic as that is, we live with that kind of thing every day, growing up for 30 years and under martial law. So you're fighting these sort of oligarchical forces that are hell-bent on the suppression of culture and the suppression of the mind. You're seeing them operate in a very small context in Ireland. Here, a huge country, America, we sometimes don't realize that there is a big brother out there, because the country's so vast, it's really a continent you're talking about. But when you're dealing with, like Belfast, Northern Ireland, you're dealing with such a small demographic, such an enclosed place, that it's very obvious to see what exactly the religions and the governments are up to, politically, culturally, religiously. And most of it is mind control. It's just oppression. But then I come to this country, and, this was a hobby. I started studying Atlantis, and, let me say the Celtic aspect of it, like what the ancient Celtic records were saying, and that includes, by the way, the English traditions too. That includes the King Arthur mythologies and what have you. At 13, but had no idea in the wide world that it would ever, I'd ever do a book on it or anything like that. Furthest thing from my mind. I do other things. That I'm very involved in astrology and have online school and do a lot of different things professionally. This was what I would have called a hobby, a side thing. And the next thing you know, it's just that over here there's an overwhelming interest, not only in Irish history, but in the alternative history of the world. And this is where I come in, because my interests are very much in the alternative history.
And when you say alternative history, is it non-Western or just beyond non-Western? Is it a global?
I mean the concealed history of the world. You see, Africa, Russia, as we're now starting to discover, thank God, through some work of some brilliant researchers, and most of them are American again. This brings us right back to the same point again. Most of the greatest alternative historians are from this country. The Jim Marrs of the world. Sure, we have Graham Hancock and people from Europe, but there's a lot in this country There's a whole line of people who've studied the alternative history of the world, and what that means is the suppressed or sequestered history, the actual facts about what really goes on, not the official, stuff that's maybe put in textbooks or certainly in the newspapers, which is 8th grader level. We're talking about here is the real history of the planet, and these countries, including America, has an occult history. There's nothing sinister about the word occult; it just means the hidden. There's a hidden history of America that a lot of people in this country are going to really need to know about very quickly because of what's coming down now. And we have to know about something about the secret societies and fraternal orders that move behind government, because as I've learned in Ireland, where this is a very obvious fact, actually, they kind of don't hide this a lot, but you see, it makes perfect common sense that if there are cabals, fraternities that are secret, operating behind religion and government, then it's like you and me, making a promise with our fingers crossed behind our back. If these people have allegiances other than their allegiances to the people of the country, which of course I know they do, then what good are their promises? What good are their political promises? And that's why nothing's ever changed in hundreds of years, because these individuals owe their allegiances to different altars than the altar of humanity and the altar of the people, and we are seeing that every day, but we don't exactly know why.
Okay, so where should we begin with this, Michael? It seems it's a tremendous story,
it is,
and there's so many details. But really, just to understand and to get an overview, where should we begin?
Well, it is a tremendous story. It has been referred to as the greatest story never told, and it does involve the occult histories of the world, and it even involves official history too. Once you understand this alternative history of the planet and of human beings, it will explain so many conundrums and so many other issues within even what we know officially. It certainly explains what's happening in the control echelons of the world, but the real story, as I have discovered it, and remember, these are not my ideas, these are based on my studies of the comparative mythologies of the world. Jack Barringer, whose book Past Shock was a very fine book that got me sort of into a lot of this, another American researcher, he says that there are 30,000 texts in the world that deal with, visitation. These are 30,000. Remember, these are the texts that still exist after the burnings and the purgings and what have you. So you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands there would have been had there not been any kind of suppression of these texts.
And when you say visitation, we are talking about a life form or a civilization
Absolutely.
Outside of that which we know.
No
that
question
is each
about
other.
it. Carl Sagan, Professor Hermann Oberth, the father of rocketry science, Frederick Soddy, the father of radium. We have, like I said, Carl Sagan. We have Albert Einstein. The list of scientists who believe this, including Oppenheimer, it goes on and on and on. In my book, I talk about these intellectual sources that had no problem in the wide world accepting this. Many of them wrote on it. Rupert Sheldrake understood this. And today, in fact, the leading anthropologists and paleologists in Oxford and Cambridge University, this is Allen and Dallaire, who've written on these subjects, have no problem understanding that the official histories are not correct. But some scholars have gone further to say that yes, we have in fact been visited, and we still are visited. We've been visited constantly, and it's done. I mean, anyone who imagines for a moment that we're the only life forms in the universe, they need their head checked. I mean, that we don't even need to get into, because that is an absolute fact. There's 400 billion galaxies out there, 450 billion galaxies. So, it's preposterous to assume that we're alone. Now, granted that we're not alone, and granted that other civilizations on other planets have the technology to be able to cross space in whatever way they want to do that. The Gene Roddenberry's would say it's done with dilithium crystals, and Frank Herbert would say no, they're bending space. I mean, it's wonderful when you get into the science fiction of this, which has also helped us understand, but we really don't understand how it would be done. And this is a whole other field that one day will be taken seriously and will be opened up. But given that there's individuals out there on civilizations who are able to cross the galaxy, we have to accept that this planet in our solar system has been visited many times. This is the first thing. Now, my work, though, focuses on the visitation of one specific group. I do believe that this planet has been visited many times, probably still is, but it's like that old prime directive idea. Anyone who would come here to do their researches, it's obvious from even UFO paranormal sightings that these creatures do not want to be observed, and when they are observed, they try to get away. That's pretty obvious even from eyewitness accounts, that they are not happy to be observed. They're not. That's why they're, for instance, not hovering over New York City. They're coming to some place in the boonies or whatever, and there's a good reason for that, right?
Well, then, but I mean, and we'll step into it, I'm sure, further on. How do you then explain the amount of sightings, let's say, like the Phoenix Lights? I mean, where this is a major city, and there are people watching, and there are, like, credible sources and witnesses, or even the Mexico City
exactly, that huge
videos.
event. And there are many public sightings all over the world, including the two you've mentioned are probably the most famous. Let's bookmark that, because the reason for that is very, very important, and we should come to that. What I want to do is take you back to the beginning of this concept. And again, this is coming out of the Celtic records, it's coming out of suppressed books, it's coming out of the Bible, the Book of Enoch, it's coming out of apocryphal works. What that means is that these are books that were left purposely out of the Bible because of what they were containing.
Because it was put down by the Council of Nicaea.
Precisely.
And
the
Bible, yes.
And they very much wanted to expurge certain books that, were talking about this. So none of this is far-fetched at all. This can be referenced. My book is full of the references of it. There are many others that can be referenced on my website. I have innumerable links for people to check this out themselves. But according to my particular discoveries, about 50,000 years ago, our planet was in fact visited by a certain contingent. And I believe, though I am not absolutely sure, I tend to think that they came from Alpha Draconis. Now later, they're descendants of these people, and by the way, the descendants of these beings I'm going to be talking about are ruling the world today. Not them themselves, but the descendants, the bloodline descendants of these beings rule the world today. So there's a lot of disinformation that's been put out because, of course, they're not going to want to tell their history as it really is. But I tend to think that it was Alpha Draconis, and there's reasons for that.
Now, is that a galaxy?
It's a star.
Oh, okay.
And it has its own constellations. It has its own solar systems and so on. I'll tell you that one of the reasons why I think that is because the Pyramid of Giza, which is one of the greatest, if not the greatest altar on the face of the earth. I mean, the thing's visible from outer space, The descending gallery in that pyramid, which is quite narrow, if you go to the bottom of the gallery and look up, of course it tracks up into the sky, into space. Well, when the pyramid was built, the gallery, almost something like out of Indiana Jones, it focused on a part of the sky which was exactly where Alpha Draconis was. So at the bottom of the descending gallery in Giza Pyramid, if you looked up in the night through this tunnel, you would have seen Alpha Draconis. So I would wonder, why on earth would somebody go to all this, effort to build this incredible 13.5 acre, with billions of blocks of stone or whatever, and then, focus only on that star? I think they might be trying to tell us something there. So Alpha Draconis at least is on the hot list of potentials, although Sirius and Pleiades have also been mentioned. But this group that came are known by innumerable names. The Bible refers to them as the fallen angels. The Hebrew translation of that is Anakim or Nephilim, which is the most common name. The Sumerians refer to them, and the Babylonians refer to them as the Anunnaki. And the word Nephilim really means those who were cast down. Those who were cast down out of heaven, So this Luciferian satanic concept. Now, behind all of the posy is the idea that these individuals came into our solar system, but they didn't come here by chance. They were actually being pursued from their own solar system across the galaxy by factions of their own planetary system.
You say this as if we could pick it up in a book and read it.
You can, in fact, but you have to read a lot of books. It's not just in one source. And remember, like anything, it's detective. It can be described as a sort of a esoteric archaeology, where you're piecing the general things together. Because unfortunately, just like a building, imagine a bookstore that's had a friggin' Sentex bomb hit it. Yeah, the information's all there, but my God, some have titles, some don't. You don't know what the cover is. So the information is there, so you have to piece it together as best you can in a sort of a forensic style way.
So these characters, the Anunnaki,
the Nephilim,
were cast out. They were being chased across the galaxy.
That's what it sounds like from many sources, and this does include channelers. I don't totally buy into all of that stuff, but a lot of this does come from people who've channeled and people who've seen, and some of these people are quite credible. But other parts of this is documented evidence. So it's as rational to us as any documented evidence from any time period. You don't have to be taken as seriously as that. So they say that the Anunnaki were in fact a small contingent being pursued because they've been ousted from their own planetary system. And that whole saga is very interesting, but it's a very separate thing. They actually stray into our solar system, and they first land on the famous 12th planet. depending how you're counting, but there was a 12th planet in our solar system that existed between Jupiter and Mars. That's what the asteroid belt is now. It's the remnants of this great planet, and that planet is documented. One of its names was Tiamat. Tiamat is a Scandinavian term that meant the watery one, because Tiamat was, unlike our planet, was almost entirely an ocean planet of seas, saltwater seas, and it was huge. It was many times, 15 and something times bigger than our planet. And Tiamat was actually known in antiquity as the second sun. Not because it was a sun, but because just like Venus on a dark night, it would cast, it really looked effulgent. And it did that because the rays of the actual sun on its atmosphere just made it seem so resplendent. And in fact, this planet, the Nephilim, put what we might want to call a makeshift or dummy base on there in order as a decoy for their pursuers. And believe it or not, when the pursuers actually arrived here, thought that the Nephilim were on Tiamat, they destroyed it. They actually incinerated, by humanoid effort, this planet in our solar system.
Okay, so you have to pardon me, no pun intended. I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Definitely.
Just because, you're presenting information that is just quite... It's information. I'm not going to say, whether it's true or it's false. I'll leave it up for whoever's listening to decide for themselves. How the hell did you piece together, even to that point, to understand that there was at one point a 12th planet that was covered in water, that there's a base on there that was destroyed and is now the asteroid belt?
Well, this is coming from old documents like the Enuma Elish, which is a Persian book, and the Bundadish, which is another Persian book, and from the Sumerian records. This has been established, especially by Zechariah Sitchin, whose work is very important in this. I have several differences with Zechariah Sitchin's work, but again, I think they're sort of a moot point for this conversation. He has definitely uncovered the old cylinder seals, which talk about this. In fact, in Allen and Dallaire, these two scientists from Oxford and Cambridge University, they've written a book called Cataclysm, and I can read one small paragraph from that. They talk about this. They say, if we elevate the moon to planetary status, as the Sumerians appear to have done, then we have a total of 10 planets orbiting the sun today. On this basis, one planet is still currently missing from the earlier Sumerian total. Could there really have been another planet known to the Sumerians, as yet unknown to us or lost since their day? So these are not some hippie, freaky, channeling New Age, bumpkins. These are the top scientists in the world. You have MIT people like Otto Binder and Max Flint, who are very much looking into this. You have Bode's Law, which is the scientific principle that absolutely says that, mathematically speaking, between Mars and Jupiter there should be another planet there, but it's not there. But what we do have is clusters of orbiting, dust. And in the Enuma Elish, it actually refers to Tiamat. Of course, it does it in poetic language. It says, go and cut off Tiamat's life, and let the winds convey her blood to the secret places.
And which text was that
This
from?
is the Enuma Elish. And it's just one of many books that talk about this. Now, see, again, here, this is a very important point for people to grasp. In some of these ancient books, they're not denotative accounts. They're connotative and they're poetical. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of this information has yet not come forth. Because we, being very left-brain and very sort of what I would consider dumbed down, but we're not using our whole brain anymore. We've lost this ability to decode. We have lost our symbol literacy. We've lost our pattern recognition skills. So when we read this stuff, to us it's just folk tales.
Wait, what do you mean? I guess I don't see myself as someone who's necessarily lost my ability to think. How are you?
It's the cognitive centers. We have a society that has conditioned us from educational, right, in our education, to be very right-brained, very linear, very what we would consider factual. But facts are not necessarily truth. What I'm really trying to say is that in a lot of these old texts, just because it's written down in a sort of a, what appears to be a fanciful way or a fictitious way, we tend to immediately discount it and not, make it as important to us. Look at Professor Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings. I mean, the guy spoke about Celtic mythology. He spoke about Hyperborea and Numenor. He spoke of things that were absolutely known to be existent, but he did it in a fictional way. There's reasons for this. So again, even the most ancient of books, the tendency is to write them in this specific, what might be called, you have to be symbolically literate to decode it. And look at the ancient Egyptians. They didn't write words. They wrote in hieroglyphics. So the whole idea was they're on graphic, reference. Now, when the Judeo-Christian paradigm came into town, what did they immediately do? They have an edict in the Ten Commandments that says, "Thou shalt not make graven images," which was a prohibition against making images of God or images of being or images of meaning. Well, why does that prohibition come before "thou shalt not kill"? Many scholars like Leonard Schlein have wondered about this. It's more important to not make images than it is to murder somebody? That's right. In Judeo-Christianity, which is, of course, the hegemony that's really in power now, was very much against this idea of figurative representation. But we cannot decode the history of our planet without awakening that again. Now, in these ancient books, it definitely talks about the fact, the presence of a planet, and it's not there now, and most people think it just blew up because of some, intervening comet. This is what Zachariah Sitchin believes, and I do not agree with that. If you read Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed authors in the world, his books are very, very hard to find, or Immanuel Velikovsky, who is the, not one of, but the most lambasted, scholars in the world.
In fact, my biology teacher in high school, Kirk Brill, brought up during the I think we were starting to talk about evolution, and I don't know if Jake, did you have Mr. Brill, or were you with Mooney?
No, I had Mr. Brill, but I didn't necessarily pay that much attention in his class.
I paid specific attention to this because he brought in papers from Velikovsky talking about how Venus was at one point a comet, and it was trapped somehow in the solar system. I think that was Velikovsky's
That is
theory.
totally Velikovsky. He was an expert on Venus. In fact, many of the discoveries we have today about Venus, not only Venus, but our solar system, come from him because he's been proved right every time. This so-called lambasted visionary, this so-called unscientific, wannabe, has now turned out, after so many years, to be 100% correct, and all his detractors are wrong. So here we have this whole problem again. But Velikovsky also talks about the fact that cometary bodies may have done it. I have subsequently found out that that's not quite true. They were on the right track there, but that the planet was actually destroyed by this humanoid element. It's in the myth and legends, if you know what you're looking at.
Tiamat.
Tiamat, yeah. It had many other names. In fact, the word Lucifer, son of the morning, was one of the ancient names of that planet. Which wasn't a bad thing. That just meant the son of the morning. And it was called Marduk, Rahab in the Bible. There's been many names for this particular body. And it was 15 times larger than the earth. And it was actually destroyed because these individuals that were pursuing the Nephilim, now we don't actually know whether these people who were pursuing the Nephilim were any more good or worse. We don't know these things,
and we haven't quite gotten to the point where we're defining the characterizations of the Nephilim.
It's really impossible because, see, there's certain things we know and certain things we don't know. We don't know if those pursuers were equally as evil, or what we want to call that. It's all relative. But what we do know is that the Nephilim didn't come here by choice. We also know that you don't drive your car through an earthquake by choice. So the destruction of that planet caused immense devastation cosmically. A lot of planets were pulled off their normal orbits. Ancients claim that the moon is a remnant. It certainly looks like a remnant of something with all the pock marks on it. It's certainly vastly bigger than any other satellite of any other planet. So very quickly what they say is that our planet was in total chaos. And more importantly for us, and remember I'm dating this about 50,000 years ago, the destruction of the water planet Tiamat caused Earth's first deluge. So that famous flood, which is accounted for in every civilization in the world, I don't care what civilization you're talking about, and this was one of Velikovsky's also great discoveries, is he understood that they were not only talking about flood, they all were speaking about it happening at the same time. A great deal of effort had been put into making it look like, or appear to us on paper, that these were all different timings, because remember every civilization uses a different calendar. So it had been put before us that these cranks, these ancient, shamans and these scribes were utterly talking nonsense because, the times were wrong. But Velikovsky came along, studied every single one of these cultures, made an objective calendar in which you could plot their individual time calendars, and found out they're all exactly at the same time, which is approximately 40,000, 50,000 years ago. Now this deluge, which means, space is a cryogenic chamber. But when you have an exploded planet with water, salt water, streaming through the atmosphere, it's collected in the Roche field and in the stratosphere. It's attracted by the magnetic pull of our planet, which it still is today, by the way. And then a lot of it falls as debris. And that's the famous 40 days of rain, the tremendous climatical upheavals that have been all scientifically approved now. There's not a thing that I'm saying that is not absolutely scientifically documented now.
You mean in terms of there being a deluge?
Right, but not only that, that has been already understood, But I'll go further than that. It has now been understood that the deluge came from up there.
Wait, is this like a new bit of
Yeah, this is
evidence?
Oh, yeah.
Like, people want proof. They
Yes.
want
Well, they need
controversial
right.
proof.
All of my stuff has this proof. Allen and Dallaire, their first book on this subject was called When the Earth Nearly Died. Their second book is called Cataclysm. These are the top, and I mean the top scientists in Oxford and Cambridge University who've looked into the whole question of Velikovsky and so on. They conclude that our planet, as von Däniken had been saying years before, had not got hardly any ocean on it. In fact, it didn't have, the only water that was on this planet prior to 50,000 years ago was what we call the Miocene Ocean, which was in Russia where the Caspian and Black Sea are. But the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic and all of the rest of it did not exist. That can be proven now. They're thinking that this destruction of Tiamat might have, and for those who are really into science fiction, we can even add that maybe even the active destruction of these aliens gouged out what we know to be the Pacific Gorge in one go. Now that sounds unbelievable until you realize that it is now officially understood by geologists that the Grand Canyon might have been carved out in one day.
Oh,
Yep. This is so.
is there?
There's a lot of research out of this. This is official. This is official fact that it has now been understood that the Grand Canyon at the Colorado River could have actually happened in not maybe one day, but a very short time, a matter of hours and days.
Do they know how?
Yes, they do know how. In these books, you will find evidence of the meteor and the cometary implosions that took place all over the world. I have a lot of information on this in my book. So let's just say for now, we can't push the point because people need to go to the sources and read it, because it does sound preposterous. It's meant to sound preposterous because the world around us has not been explained properly. And Carolina, anyone who's lived in North and South Carolina, in Georgia, know about the impacts of thousands upon thousands of meteors, thousands upon thousands of them that have hit there in times of old. Scholars have discovered that there's something very bizarre about the Grand Canyon, and I think that possibly this recent cataclysm in the solar system may have even precipitated the gouging out of the Pacific. Now, the waters that pour in here, they liquefy. They're probably coming in as rocks of ice, and that's exactly what the ancient legends say. But of course, passing through our atmosphere, they liquefy again and fall as rain. The Celtic books are adamant about this. In the Welsh Chronicle, the Book of Taliesin, there's actually a very famous book. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Book of Taliesin. Taliesin was the great poet of the Welsh. The Welsh have the highest regard for Taliesin because he is like sort of, in one way, a contemporary or a similar being as Merlin. Everyone in the world has heard of Merlin. Well, Merlin was actually based on an old Celtic poet that lived many thousands of years before him, but also was the Welsh poet Taliesin, and in his works, Taliesin talks about that the waves, that there was this descent. I have the quote right here. Here it is. This is from again, it's poetic. So he says, I have been in the boat of Dylan. Dylan is the famous a word that means the ocean. Anybody who's called Dylan, it actually means the black waves of the ocean. So he says, I've been in the boat of Dylan, the son of the wave, when the waters rose as lances falling down from the skies into the exposed abyss. So again, direct verbatim from Geoffrey of Monmouth, from the old scribes, they're talking about this. Wormwood, in the Bible, Revelation number 8, verse 8, it says, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and many died from that water because it was made bitter. So the Bible records are talking about bitter waters, which was not known on this earth before. Wormwood, a star in the heaven, and the great lament, and people dying from this tumult. The Navajo Indians, the Zunis, you name it. In my book I go into this, almost all the traditions to show that this happened.
Cross-culturally.
Yes, so that's very important to do that. See, Zachariah Sitchin, one of my sort of peeves with Zachariah, even though he's a great scholar, he is focused almost entirely on the Sumerian Babylonian record. And there's problems with that. We might get to talk about those later. But yeah, you do need to cross-reference.
You're not the only challenger. As a matter of fact, the Watcher website, I don't know if you're familiar with, I believe he's actually got a doctorate now. And I caught his presentation at the Ancient of Days conference, which is put on by Guy Malone in, of all places, Roswell, New Mexico. And I believe they're going to be doing another one at some point in the near future. And Mike Heiser, I believe is his name, and he has also called out Zechariah on a few different points.
And that's inevitable because, and we'll come to that, hopefully, because my analysis of Sitchin goes quite deep. I don't put my differences first because that's just nonsense. Starting to do that would lead you off on so many tangents of who believes in who and who's... we want to get away from that and look at the commonalities, but there are some very important fallacies in Zechariah Sitchin's work. But he also then talks about this lost planet. Now, the most important thing we need to know, I mean, that was traumatic enough, having our planet be, going through this cataclysm. But it was worse because the Nephilim that were meant to be hiding out on Tiamat weren't hiding there at all. They were hiding here on this planet, underneath the tree line, in caves, in the hollow earth caves that they found by doing scans of this planet, and also on some that they carved from themselves. Many scholars specialize only in that area of the underground caves of our planet. Now, given that many continents have already sank beneath the waves, we still have a lot of these labyrinthine caves. I believe that prior to the flood, prior to these other cataclysms, there was even more. That the continents that would have existed, I think, were catacombed with a great deal more. So they claim, and the Celtic legends even talk about, and the Scandinavian legends even talk about, that the fallen angels had ability in their crafts to go under the water. They actually were able to take refuge under the seas. And they were able to successfully hide out, and their opponents, these people that were pursuing them, again, because of the celestial upheavals they had now caused, couldn't stick around too long to, find out, do more thorough research. So they left. And the Nephilim, after a semblance of normality had returned to our planet, emerged from their hiding places, and they grouped themselves on the continent of Appalachia. Now, the continent of Appalachia was in the North Atlantic. It's still there. They've now discovered it. Buried in the North Atlantic, it's fathoms down under the ocean, is an entire continent. And the scientists have given the name of this Appalachia. And it's Appalachia was the continent upon which Atlantis was founded. So anyone who's listening to this, who's already done some homework into Atlantis, please understand that when we talk about Atlantis, there's a lot of disinformation out there. Atlantis was not a continent. And this is one small piece, but I think an important one to clear up. The continent was Appalachia, and Atlantis would be like what Washington is, or a city-state, a city complex. It's erroneous to say, Atlantis was itself the name of the continent. This also brings up a lot of problems if you believe that, because then, of course, what's happening throughout the ages? Everybody who turns over a rock in the Syrian desert says they found Atlantis. It's a perennial thing, right? So, there's that to take on board. But keeping to our story, the Nephilim appeared. They had incredible sophistication. They did set up. They couldn't leave immediately because of the celestial upheaval, so they set up their base on Atlantis. And after that, in the years that followed, they started to actually do reconnaissance, send out contingents of these individuals. Now, remember, our ancestors, the individuals who were living on this planet that we know next to nothing about, saw all of this upheaval. I mean, you couldn't miss it, right?
And when you say upheaval, you're talking about stuff that's happening in the sky.
So, I mean, they talk about it. They talk about the sky turning red, the gods, the wars of the gods, the
Vedic texts.
The Vedic texts, and there was horror and fright, fear, tremendous fear, which is still encoded in our DNA today. In fact, in the race memory, we have a lot of fear of certain things, especially the ocean. These fears that have been put down to us, human fears and phobias that are considered to be psychological, are actually physiological, if you get into it. But our ancestors did see this and were really horrified by these travesties that were taking place. And they believed, therefore, when these remarkable beings, who, by the way, were humanoid, these are not reptilians like some people have been saying, they're humanoid, you actually could pass them by in the streets. The real legends, the real mythologies, the ones that are credible, say they were probably a little bit taller than us, certainly lived a lot longer, were very highly intelligent. They would point to the stars when they were asked about their origins. They did speak in strange tongues. This whole idea, many records talk about them having two heads. That sounds far-fetched, again, if you're using the left brain, but what it really means is that they had space helmets with two faces. One face would look like the helmet, and the real face would be inside. Ancients not knowing how to account for that, like in the book of Ezekiel, you get all of this poetic language from Ezekiel about the strange crafts and so on. So, again, we have to use our right brain to decode what we're actually hearing when we're hearing these references. Now, the Bible is full of the mention, by the way, of this visitation, just as we're on that point here in the book of Ezekiel.
And that's actually in the Bible, as opposed to Enoch, which was left out.
Exactly. Let me read you this from the book of Ezekiel. Anyone can pick up a Bible, go to Ezekiel and read this. It says, "And Eve," Now we'd wonder why Eve has even been mentioned in a later book. But it says, "Then Eve looked up to heaven and saw a shining chariot, come drawn by 4 gleaming angels, whose glory no one born of woman could express, nor look upon their face, and the angels went before the chariot." Now, of course, if you're a primitive person, let's say quote-unquote primitive, and you didn't have technological expertise, you would explain things like that. And the book of Ezekiel and the book of Genesis 15, Ezekiel 1:20, talk about the pillar of cloud and the movement of this, what they also call the whirlwind, that used to clip the mountains and clip the trees. You know, in the book I go into all of this. There's lots and lots of accounts from the Bible of these crafts. But this was seen, and then the Atlanteans, basically moving along with the story, they were making contact with the indigenous population of the earth. Now, as I said before when we opened, there's been many encounters here, probably thousands of them. This one group is special because they decided to intervene in a way that was very much taboo.
So the Atlanteans, are they descendants from the Nephilim?
Yeah, and it's good that you made that point, because now we can in fact refer to, it's good to refer now to these Anakim or the Nephilim as the Atlanteans, because they are the founders of Atlantis. Atlantis was not founded or created by anyone on this planet. It was an alien base. And that has to be firmly understood in order to make sense of where we're going now. These giants, or the Nephilim, they, in the Kebra Nagast, which is another book, like the Enuma Elish, another book is called the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, which is a very important book. It's as important as the Popol Vuh of the Maya, and it's as important as the book of Enoch. In that book, they talk about the fact that these visitors wanted to interact sexually with the earth female, and they actually tried it. And here's the quote from the Kebra Nagast. And remember, these are old books. Some of these are not even books. They were clay tablets, you know. These are remarkable finds. And you can imagine why a lot of them have been hidden. And it says, "And the daughters of Cain," the word Cain goes back to the word meaning serpent, and we'll get into that a little bit later. "But the daughters of the serpent, or the daughters of Cain, with whom the angels had companied, conceived." All right, so they say that it kind of worked. They conceived at least. "But they were unable to bring forth their children, and they died. And of the children who were in their wombs, some died, and some came forth, having split open the bellies of their mothers, they came forth by their navels." So this is like something out of Rosemary's frickin' Baby, you know. It didn't basically work, right? So the Bible more than hints at it. The ancient books definitely talk about it, that there was companying taking place. This is a central theme that can be proven by anyone who's done even 5 minutes of homework into this field. But my work goes on to show that they didn't stop there. When they realized that this was, like, you know, totally not working out, they went one step further. And this one step that they went further, the committing of this great sin, is the thing that changed our history forever. Now, the Bible refers to it as a great sin. In the book of Enoch, they do likewise. In fact, in the book of Enoch, it says, "And then Samyaza," this is the name of the leader, there's many names for that leader of these beings, "he says unto them," and that's a direct quote, he says, "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." What that means is that it implies that even the leaders, these visitors, knew absolutely that they were not going to do something that contravened sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, genetic sovereignty, whatever. And the scholars of the world, and I mean almost all of the scholars of the world, believe that that still involves impregnation of the females. It does not. It refers to something infinitely worse. It refers to the crossing of the alien DNA with our DNA. This event took place on Atlantis, in the precincts there. It took place in what the Bible refers to as the Garden of Eden, because the word Eden goes back to a term that just means the enclosed space. The DNA, as we know today by looking at it, has always looked like a serpentine shape. It's very serpentine-like. And for thousands of years, the knowledge of DNA, and let's just get that straight, that this is not a modern discovery, as you were introducing earlier. This high science was known millennia ago. This is probably the big hurdle for a lot of people, but, you know, as time goes by, we're not going to have to hide it. It's there for anyone who wants to know about this. The fact is that the DNA has a serpentine look, the DNA helix. And therefore, in ancient times, those who worked with that kind of technology referred to themselves as the people of the serpent. And that also comes from the Hebrew, because the word for serpent doesn't have any vowels, but it's sort of pronounced like Nahash or Nakhash. Nakhash, N-H-S-H, that term also means to find out. or to discover. So it referred to scientists. So there's a connection between the symbol of the serpent, the word serpent, snake, and those who are the scientists. We still see this today as the caduceus is used on the medical profession. All over the world you'll see the medical profession using this ancient occult symbol of the twin serpents, right? Because it's understood that the knowledge of biology involves this, and it's a very ancient symbol. We have to understand how to decode these symbols and find out what they mean. So basically, the beings that were on this planet pre-visitation were interfered with genetically, just like it says in Genesis 1.
No, wait, come again? Could you run that by me again?
Yeah, that the individuals that we might know as the name of whatever, Neanderthal, Angus, Cro-Magnon, these terms need to be again reviewed, because for what I'm saying, we can't go by official records. But whatever entity was our forefather pre-visitation was made contact. The gods made contact with these beings. They studied their DNA thoroughly. They made diagnostic tests on Atlantis in some sort of hideous, Planet of the Apes type experimentation, and then they crossed their own DNA with our ancestors, creating another entity, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Genesis 1, when it says that God said, "Let us make man in our image," if you go back to the original Aramaic and Hebrew translation of that term, it does not say that. It says, let us the gods remake man in our image. So there's this.
According to whose translation?
The original rabbinical translation. The original rabbinical translation that is actually officially is accepted by rabbis. Okay? And then in Corinthians, if you need more proof than that, go to 1 Corinthians 15. I hope this doesn't sound like a Bible lecture here, but look at the book in a new way, right? When you open your eyes to the Bible, something amazing, suddenly you start to understand this damn book as opposed to listening to what's coming off the pulpit, which is nothing but propaganda. But you go to 1 Corinthians 15 and it says, it's a remarkable passage there, it's amazing to me they left it in. It says, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. So now suddenly, out of the blue, why didn't they teach us this in Sunday school? You got two Adams, right? What are they saying? The first Adam became a living being, the last Adam a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural. And after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man from heaven. It's all there, once we know how to decode what that means. When they mean spiritual, they mean engineered. Spiritual meaning not of the earth. When they say of the earth, of nature, they mean the ordinary dude, the ordinary guy that's made in the normal evolutionary sense. What this term spiritual is a code word, it's a replacement word, meaning of something different going on here. But the very fact they're talking about two atoms, and one of them comes from the heavens, or is made from the heavens. Very interesting thing there. And so I would say that when you hear about this concept of the firstborn in the Bible, which uses that term a lot, we have to understand that it refers to a remarkable being that I refer to in my work as Homo Atlantis, just for the fact that he was created on Atlantis. Now, this being from which a lot of us are descended had alien DNA and human, let's use that term, DNA. And I believe, or my specific work, being more philosophical, traces back this thing about evil. We were talking about the presence of injustice and cruelty and evil in the world. It seems to be just besetting our world for generations, and nobody seems to be able to work it out. This schism, this schizoid being that was created, even though he was extremely advanced scientifically and he had all this human component, unfortunately the transgenic experimentation created this proclivity that we would know to be evil in the world. Evil has a time and a date. It's not the creation of nature. It's anyone who believes that it is again laboring under a vast folly, a vast misapprehension. How can we, for instance, imagine that nature, which is in perfect harmony, scientists study nature, it's in perfect equilibrium and harmony from the largest neutron star to the smallest quantum particle, what we call the natural order, right? How then can this thing, which is in perfect equilibrium, make such a blunder in its highest species, man, to create something that would undermine her own order, which is this penchant for ecocide and cruelty and belligerence? And by the way, let's not forget, man is very distinct from other primates because he's the only being that actually takes pleasure from his sadism. We certainly see certain kinds of violence in animals, but we certainly don't see pleasure out of it. The human being, sad to say, how many people in this world have asked that question? Not just great scholars, but even laymen. What is it that really, really makes us different from the animal or the primate, well, are we really ready for the answer? I mean, do we really want the answer to that? The answer is our cruelty to one another, our injustice. Now, my work is to explain this, because I'm not a ufologist. I'm not a person who's really that interested in paranormal subject matter, and I make this clear when I do talks to people who are from that persuasion. I am more from a philosophical background. My central concern is not ancient times. I mean, I've studied that for a purpose, because I am fascinated and interested with what's going on now. I am a person who's very much in this world. I'm not just, studying ancient things because I got nothing better to do. I am tracking something, the origins of evil, because in the 21st century, in a very, very short time, and I predict this in the preface of the Atlantis book, we are going to discover the truth about our origins and our destiny. And along with that, one of the first things that comes with that is the discovery of this thing about the phenomena of evil. How did it come into the world? How did it come into human nature? There's an incredible thesis here to be studied. I'm only making a small movement into it. But it comes from this transgenic experimentation. And the being that was created, I refer to as Homo Atlantis, because he was born or created on Atlantis. Now, the most interesting next stage after thousands of years go by, because, of course, why was Homo Atlantis created? Because he was meant to be a servant. All the books, every single one of them, talks about this being, that they were created because they were meant to be a servant race. Remember the old John Milton Paradise Lost idea, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven? Well, the watchers who came here, the Nephilim, wanted slaves. They wanted servants, and this is why they went to all this labor of experimenting on our forefathers to create this race. Now, this race, of course, being advanced intellectually like their forefathers, and also having this other component that their forefathers did not recognize, which is this human component. We might want to call it emotion. Some people might want to call it soul. It's really difficult to put words to that. But they had this other component that their alien masters did not have, because the alien masters, of course, had full alien DNA. Well, what this led to was the first exodus, because Homo Atlantis refused after a certain time to, go along with the status quo situation, and actually moved out of Atlantis en masse. They left the precincts of Atlantis, and there's even records that they did it in spacecraft. And they set up their own thriving civilization on another landmass, which was near where the Pacific is today, that was called Oceania, and it's better known to scholars as Lemuria. So the Lemurians are actually created by the Atlanteans, but they decide to leave. And from that moment on, they become a rival faction. Now, that's already a vast story, just that fact itself. I mean, one of the greatest texts that talk about this is an Indian Tamil text. The Tamils are people from Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in the southern part of India, and they have some unpronounceable documents down there of their old legends. The Silapadarakan is one of the books, and they refer to this island in the Pacific, and they actually call it the Kamai Nadu, or the Kamari Kandam, which meant the dragon land of the immortal serpents. Again, a reference to the gods, a reference to great scientists who set up base on Lemuria. And of course now, it all would have ended there, except that the Atlanteans, they did not particularly like this, and they decided to go back to their drawing boards to create another being, a Mark II entity, a Mark II slave. And we might want to call that being Adamic, because the beings that are referred to in the Bible of Adam and Eve are not individuals, and if you think of that, it makes no sense at all. We have to learn, like your American scholar Ignatius Donnelly, who is one of the greatest Atlantean scholars ever lived, he fully understood this, that when you're talking about the Elohim and Jehovah, when you're talking about Adam and Eve, you're talking about multiplicities. This has to be understood plurally, not in singular. So the atoms were created, and not wanting to have a repeat of the first problem, it was decided by the Atlanteans that they would turn off or dumb down the higher intelligence centers of these new slaves, because they didn't want the same rebelliousness before. Now, I mean, my God, today they can sit you in an armchair in some laboratory, stick a couple of probes in your head, and you'll be dumbed down in like half an hour. Think what you can do when you have access to the genome. That's exactly what happened. So the Bible and the ancient books refer to this as being Adam and Eve being sent naked into the garden. Which of course makes no sense at all until you realize it is not physical nakedness that's being spoken of there. It's another cryptic phrase, another cover story that means intellectual nakedness, psychological nakedness, unintelligent. And they were sent forth. Now, many books were purged. that had this information. So we only have scraps left, but one of the most appealing and sensational and utterly amazing references to this is from the Mexican codices. There's very few of them left, but the most important one for people to know about is called the Popol Vuh. I have the quote in my book, and the quote says, "Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us." Okay, this is the gods talking. They say, "Let us make him who shall nourish and sustain us. What shall we do to be invoked, to be remembered in earth? We have tried with our first creatures, but could not make them venerate us. So then, let us try to make obedient, respectful beings who shall nourish and sustain us."
And what's that from? The Popol Vuh?
The Popol Vuh. So you can imagine now, just reading that one little, caption, how the elites of the world would want to burn and destroy and just genocidally destroy all of it. My God, if this is a sample of what they contain, no wonder. So this Adamic man was to be dumbed down. The Epic of Atrahasis, which is another ancient book, dates to about 2,000 years BC, which was found in Assyria, also mentions this, that the gods wanted to create a slave race in order to just produce food and to do mining and to be basically a primitive sort of creature. But here's the problem. The Lemurians, who had now, gone south, as we say, and set up their own thriving civilization, they had suspected that their fathers might do something like this and had been keeping surveillance over Atlantis just in case. When they actually did find out that their Atlantean forefathers had gone back to the drawing boards, they had a bit of a predicament, or what you might want to call a dilemma, because you see, in a way, the Adamic man, by also having human DNA, was in a way a genetic cousin to the Lemurians.
So also being a hybrid.
Being a hybrid. Yeah. So the Lemurians, just like you or I, you see, we would say, okay, look, we got free, of that prison, but wait a minute, here's our cousins and brothers all in servitude there without the faintest idea what's going on. Can we leave them, in that state? And they decided no, that they couldn't. So the story goes that agents, ambassadors from the Lemurians were sent surreptitiously into the fields of Eden, or into Atlantis, or into basically the empire of Atlantis, which is probably now spread all over the world, to make contact with these dumbed down cousins of theirs, the Adams and the Eves, to try and tell them basically, hey, know ye not your gods, what we can do, you can do also and more, and if you come with us too, where we are, we will awaken you to all that's been hidden from you. And the stories go that the Adams, which were the male component here, were completely not getting it. They just were not responsive. Now this story, of course, became corrupted in the Bible later on. When we unravel it and find the original prototypical stories that the book of Genesis story is based on, you find a most interesting tale. And the Eves, they say, these are the female component, they seem to be attracted or interested in the sons of the serpent, these Lemurians that were coming in.
When you say they say, could you clarify that? In this case, what was based, or what was the book of Genesis based upon?
This was it was specifically based, let's see now, I can't really, this Epic of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a bunch of, it's just not on the tip of my mind right now,
That's
but I'll
fine.
probably come
okay.
to it.
I was curious.
There are, I have that information documented. There are original texts that the Bible directly comes from. And in that book, in these books, they talk about the fact that there was a little bit of resistance from the Adams. But the Eves were sort of getting it because of some unspeakable attraction to these gods, basically. And they precipitated the move out of Eden. Now, the Bible rescripts this later to make the female the reason for the fall. In fact, they script it so that the serpent that comes into the garden is actually a tempter, the son of evil and all that rubbish, right? Which, of course, if you actually start reading it, makes zero sense whatsoever, because why would God create a Satan and blah, blah, blah? The whole thing becomes a contortion, a Gordian knot of questions. Well, that's because you got the wrong story. Get the right story, look at it from the right way, and suddenly it makes sense. These beings that came in were actually liberating forces. And one of the experts on this particular little saga that I'm talking about right here was the great occultist and theosophist Helena Blavatsky. So anyone who really wants to look into this needs to look into her book Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, because she has just an encyclopedic knowledge of the texts that go with this period that I'm talking about. I'm glad that you asked me that question of sources, because the real key person there to look into is Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. She was very much into this. And also in American context, you have Lana Cantrell, L-A-N-A, Lana Cantrell, who wrote a book called The Greatest Story Never Told. quite a hard book to get, but it's still available, and she will go into all of this sources as well about this particular area. And basically the Adams and the Eves, they do accompany these new mentors of theirs, the Lemurians, and they do go to Lemuria. Maybe not all, but a vast, enough of a number to make the Atlanteans very, very unhappy. Now we come to the part of the story which was really what we opened with, which was the technology aspect. This is the third time now that the Atlanteans have been snubbed. I mean, I can kind of understand it from their point of view. First of all, you get chucked out of your own planetary system. You come to a planet which is too small, or you don't even really know why you're here. You can't really readily leave. Then you make a perfect servant who won't serve you. Then you make the perfect servant, but they're seduced away. So it's like 3 times now you've been snubbed.
The Chris Perillo Show is brought to you by Microsoft Windows Media. Download Windows Media Player 10 at Microsoft.com/Windows Media.
When you say, just before you dive into that they couldn't leave, if they had the technology to get here, why?
Because of the cataclysm that had happened with Tiamat.
The cataclysm, so...
The solar upheavals.
So the
celestial upheaval.
Okay, so something was keeping them
Something
somehow.
was keeping them here. It was so severe, and I'm thinking that there's something that was keeping them here, but I think originally they were just a little bit, they probably wanted to colonize this planet anyway, so I think they had various reasons for staying, not just one, but several. I think one of the things was fear of leaving. They didn't know, for instance, if those pursuers were out there, so they wanted to sort of stick around. Then they wanted to colonize the planet. They realized it was very rich. And I think that there was a fear of leaving. There's a bunch of components, and one very important, all-conclusive reason, but we'll have to come to that in a minute. Where we are in the story now is that they'd
been snubbed.
Yeah, and the wrath. The books describe the incredible wrath of the Atlanteans against the Lemurians, and they respond with what the records clearly describe as a war, an atomic war, a global thermonuclear war.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the dawn of man, the dawn of what we believe civilization is, and it started with a nuclear war?
We're talking about that, not right away. I mean, the coming of these beings was about 50,000 years ago. The war we're talking about was about 14 to 13,000 years ago. So there had been a lot of time elapsed while the building of Atlantis, the colonization of the planet, the various hybridization programs, many thousands of years have elapsed in this time. But around about 13 to 14,000 years ago, there was this war. All the records are now speaking about it. The fossil record is your best, betrayer of this fact, and those who've done their homework, and there are many of the top scientists of the world have proved this now. This is why this information is finally coming out. They have shown that there was something devastating here. Now remember we talked about the deluge? It was originally thought that the evidence that they see in the fossil record from about 13,000 years ago that shows untold extinctions on this planet and just mayhem of unimaginable proportions, they thought that was originally the deluge. That has now been rescripted. They've realized that the deluge, there was 2 things that have changed. And of course there's certain forces who want to make you think it's just one. But they realized that the deluge was a little bit longer ago, and my work also confirms that the deluge was previous to this. The event that we're talking about now was described in the ancient books as the War of the Gods, literally as a war of the gods with the super weaponry that they had. The Egyptian papyrus have the most stunning accounts of this. The book of Revelation, go to verse 12, talks about the war in heaven. A book of Samuel, and a very important book that was left out of the Bible called the Book of Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H, the Book of Baruch, talks about the giants. There's a quote from the Book of Baruch which says, "There were those giants famous from the beginning that were so great of stature and so expert in war." Again, the historian Manetho talks about it. There's a papyrus in Egypt from 2,000 years BC called the Upuar papyrus. All of this stuff is in the book, so don't have to take notes. But the book of Isaiah, there are just absolutely thrilling accounts in all the legends of the world of this horrendous fight that took place. And of course what interests me, and I know interests you, is the fact that great weaponry was used here. So in the book of Job, remember we talked about the symbolic literacy bit? In the book of Job 14, there's a very short passage which says, "And he shall flee from the iron weapon, and the bow shall strike him through." When we read chapters like that, we have to put it in context. yeah, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, before we in our Western world had moved into some of the technologies we're discovering now, if you had read that, it wouldn't have made a bit of sense. But see, now, because we're in the 21st century, we can review a lot of this and think, wait a minute, iron weapon, the bow shall strike him through. There's other passages that talk about these super weaponry, and we can start to understand it in a new context. And in a very well-known and sacred Indian book called the Srimad Bhagavatam, this thing is about 50 volumes. 50 volumes, and many of these volumes feature this thing with the War of the Gods. And they talk about there's a passage there which talks about a demon race which invaded the planetary systems. Opposing them was the Hindu god Shiva, who possessed a powerful weapon that he fired at the enemy airships from his own. You know, Ovid, the great Greek, in his book Metamorphosis, he talks about the giants attacked the very throne of heaven, and Jupiter, you know, struck them down. The Norse Edda is filled with it. The Norse Edda is one of the greatest scriptures for this, by the way. It has the most interesting accounts of the weaponry, along with the Vedas. They talk about also the evil afterwind, you know, like the residue, sort of the aftershock, or what you might call the
fallout.
The fallout, yeah. The Norse Edda talks a lot about that. But the most famous accounts, let's say, were let me, before I go on to the Mahabharata, which has the most interesting accounts, there's Exodus 7. I draw your attention to Exodus 7, where it says, "And Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river, and all the river waters that were in the river were turned to blood." This bit of, you always hear about the rod, is actually a weapon of some kind. So in the Bible, when you hear that, just remember you're hearing about a form of weaponry, and if you read the rest of the passage, suddenly it'll start to be clear. But for those who are fascinated by the idea of just focus on this one area, for people who are not even into this whole thing, if they just get a grip on this one area of super weaponry, super technology, ancient technology, this will open up a vast area of research. And I'll read a few quotes from the ancient mythologies. In the Mahabharata dates from thousands of years BC, and when it was first written down, those scribes said it was already thousands of years old by that time, which pushes it back to about 20,000 years, 14,000 years, and so on. This is a direct quote from the Mahabharata, the ancient text of India. It says, "The Subha," this is the spacecraft, "the Subhas clung to the sky at a league's length. He threw at me rocks, missiles, spears, spikes, battle axes, three-bladed javelins." Right, we know about those heat-seeking missiles and the ones, what's that, the Scud missiles that split open or whatever? Well, they're talking about the three-bladed javelins, flame-throwers, without pausing. "The sky seemed to hold 100 suns, 100 moons, and 100 myriad stars. Neither day nor night could be made out, or the points of the compass." The Ramayana, which is another one of the great Indian texts, mentions an iron thunderbolt capable of killing hundreds of thousands of humans. It was also said to be so powerful that it would have destroyed the earth. These weapons could only be used by royal decree. There's even passages where it mentions the fact that the weapon was used first as retaliation for the other side using it first. I mean, where have we heard that story before, right? Then there's a book called the Samargana Sudrahara. There is mention of manned space rockets as well as their means of propulsion. In the book known as the Samara Sudrahara, we find mention of the use of biological weapons, each of which produces its own specific results. There's a weapon called the Samhara, which debilitated its victims by attacking the motor center of the brain. And then the other weapon that they refer to is the Moha, M-O-H-A, which caused blockage of nerve impulses, resulting in complete paralysis. In a Chinese book called the Feng Shen Veni 1, we find descriptions of germ warfare, and again references made to specific weapons causing specific results. We have in the Mahabharata translations of this, because I know your next question is, my goodness, how come we didn't know about this before? Because when the British forces, again, just like they'd done in Ireland, when they moved into India and commissioned the translation of these books, they generally left these descriptions out. They would have said they thought they were fanciful. Well, if they're fanciful, then just leave them in and let everybody make up their mind. No, they were left out for other reasons. At Mohenjo-daro in India, just like in the Iraqi desert, there has been crystallized, fused glass found beneath the soil. If you go down there, you'll find what looks like fused glass, implying that nuclear explosions had taken place. They found that at Sodom and Gomorrah, the place where they say that Sodom and Gomorrah took place in the Asia Minor. They found tektites, radioactive tektites, to this day. In Scotland, there's a castle with one whole side of it is just fused glass. It's something that hit it, you know. The legends locally talk about the very things we're talking about here. Here's another quote from the Mahabharata, which is very famous. It's in the book. It says, "It was as if the elements had been unleashed. The sun spun round, scorched by the incandescent heat of the weapon. The world reeled in fever. Elephants were set on fire by the heat and ran to and fro in a frenzy. Water boiled, animals died. The enemy was mown down, and the raging of the blaze made the trees collapse. Horses and war chariots were burned up. Thousands of chariots were destroyed. Then deep silence descended on the sea. The corpses of the fallen were mutilated by the terrible heat so that they no longer looked like human beings. Never before have we seen such a ghastly weapon, and never before have we heard of such a weapon."
And this wasn't written in, like, 1950. This is...
6,000 years BC, at least. We know that because if you cross-reference it with the Irish text, you're going back that far. Now, another quote from the same... And these are volumes long. I mean, the Mahabharata would probably fill, you know, from here to the ceiling, right? "A single projectile," it says, "charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and fire as bright as 10,000 suns, from a shaft fatal as the rod of death." There's that rod of death bit again, which the Bible uses. "Endowed with the force of 1,000-eyed Indra's thunder, it was as destructive to all living creatures. Hostile warriors fell to the earth like trees burned down in a raging fire. A substance like fire has sprung into existence. Blistering hills, rivers, and trees. All are being reduced to ashes. You cruel and evil ones, drunk with pride, through that iron bolt ye shall become exterminators of your race." When we read that story about Lot and his wife in the Bible, where it says, "Don't turn back because you'll turn into a pillar of salt," that's a mistranslation. The original Aramaic, the original Hebrew translation is not salt, it's vapor. The word is much more like our English, "You'll turn into a vaporous, you'll just disintegrate." And this, by the way, anyone who wants this translation of the Mahabharata, it is the Protan Chandra Roy. Okay, so it's Protan Chandra Roy's translation in 1889. Has these particular things. But of course, if you just want to get my book, it's all in there. So it says, another quote says, "Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana," and the word Vimana translates into flying craft, by the way, "hurled against the three cities of the Varishis and the Andhakas." These are the two groups that they're talking about. And very much like I've been saying, I use terms like Atlantean and Lemurian. Another one of the most confirming things is they always talk about just two main contingents. Why not 6 or 7 or 5 or 4 or 50? It's always the two, because they're talking about what we've been mentioning here. Well, they hurled a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andhakas. So they're talking about both sides had casualties. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Now listen to this. The hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves into streams to wash themselves and their equipment. The weapon was so feared that in great distress of mind, and that's a direct quote, the king had the bolt reduced to fine powder and thrown into the sea. Even with these precautions, people's hair and fingernails fell out overnight. Birds turned white and their legs became scarlet and blistered, and food went bad. You know, we have in Pakistan 44 exhumed skeletons were found. Every one of them was found to be radioactive.
Whoa, when was this?
This is recorded in Jonathan Cray's Dead Men's Secret in the 19th century. And they dated these skeletons to 2,000 years BC. We have, let me see, there's...
2000 BC, that's quite...
Later. You see how late it is?
Yeah.
But again, what do we know about...
If we're talking the timeline...
timeline is a whole other question about who's doing the timing and what have you. Now, the most important part of this, I mean, it just goes on and on. As I said, this is a whole subject in itself. I want to read you one more very, very important quote that I found concerning this vast thing with the weaponry. In the Celtic legend, in the earliest times of conquest of Ireland. Now remember, you remember the whole thing with the luck of the Irish? Here we are on St. Patrick's Day today, and everybody's screaming about the luck of the Irish, you know. Where that actually comes from is interesting. It comes from what we're talking about. in this cataclysm, what both contingents didn't realize is that the ferocity of this war would affect the Earth itself. They say that the moisture in the atmosphere pretty much incinerated, and that the magnetic polarity of the Earth was affected grossly, and it precipitated what we know as a polar shift. So the event that happened 14,000, 13,000 years ago was not the deluge, but it was a polar shift of our axis. There's lots of evidence we don't have time to go into here to point out that about that time the Earth's axis was straight. It's what they call tholiiform, in which you had what the Greeks call ver perpetuum, perpetual spring. This is known now. The Earth went off its axis. Now, a lot of people put before you again the whole idea of pole shift means the whole reversal of the Earth. It doesn't mean that at all. It can mean a variety of different things, even just a little nudging of the axis. But this thing where we are now, 23.5 degrees or whatever it is, this occurred at this time because of this humanoid ferocity of this battle. They claim that the whole Earth was shaken. Millions of species were wiped out. Vast amount of destruction that we're saying here. The moon was drawn even closer to our orbit. Mars was affected badly. There was tumult. Remember, we're talking about other reasons why the Nephilim couldn't leave. They had now precipitated something. They had no idea. It's like in H.G. Wells' idea, he says, where the Earth responded to man's violence, and then Earth's violence. It's very true what he's saying there. None of the sides realized this was going to happen. The Earth literally around them starts moving now. What we have to understand is that deluge is one thing, even bad as it is, rocks and water falling down from the heavens and all sorts of calamity like that. That's horrendous. And after it takes hundreds of years to even a semblance of normality to return to the Earth. Pole shift, on the other hand, is a completely different thing. That's like, the Eiffel Tower stuck headfirst in Hawaii. That's boulders the size of mountains, flying through the air. I mean, it's unimaginable. They say the whole Miocene Ocean, which was at one point a time in Russia, spilled out and became the Mediterranean, leaving only the Caspian and Black Sea. Nothing could even, begin. It's written in our DNA. I mean, this is mentioned in our racial memory, but nobody can describe this. The scientists and anthropologists who've studied the flora and the fauna and the destruction, and these things called erratic boulders, which are found thousands of miles away from where the outcrops of rock were. They've discovered all of this. This is monumental cataclysm. Well, this event, what did it do? It sank the great continents. Not just Atlantis and Lemuria. There were 3 other ones that the ancients talk about. There was actually 4 continents in all. Appalachia, there was one called Tyrrhenia, which is where the Mediterranean is now. Oceania, which was Lemuria, and Beringia and Fennoscandia. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different continents that sank beneath the ocean, and that's exactly what the Celtic legends say. In the earliest books of the Celts, when they say, hey, where you guys come from? They say, we come from 4, like an archipelago of islands. So again, another disinformation about Atlantis being the only thing that sank. There was many great continents that spanned the Earth, which were gone forever beneath the ocean. And that accounts for why today, when Jim Allen and many of these other well-meaning researchers go and they turn over a rock and go, I found it, it's Atlantis. No, that's another outpost or station or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean it's Atlantis itself. Now, I want to get back to this thing where the Celtic legends, the luck of the Irish, when they survived, the remnants who might have survived this tumult, get into boats, just like in the Mayas, they even show you pictures of it. I mean, you can go to the Maya and see pictures of the guys rowing away from this almighty, sunken island and stuff like that. There's actually images of this. In Ireland, there was a succession of 5 invasions to Ireland, and they called Ireland the Blessed or the Fortunate Isles because it had survived. It was one of the land masses that they were able to settle on, and that's where you get the original idea of the Irish being lucky, because the land there was considered our salvation. And it's very interesting, beautifully poetic, it's mostly poetic, in fact, about the fact of the relationship with people with Ireland. That's also why mountains are sacred, because mountains were at that time the only place where people could have survived, you see. So the mountain entered our mythologies as being sacred, the sacred mountain, which was the salvation of man. But the 5th race that came to Ireland were the high magicians. In Irish mythology, there is no bones made about it at all. That each of these races was unique. They had godlike powers, but if you count the original indigenous people of Ireland, these very strange hybrid beings that were there, then it's the 5th race that came, and they were called the Gaelic people. And the Gaelics were the high druids. So when we're talking about the druids, we're talking about a specific group of people. They had a king whose sword, by the way, is the prototype of Excalibur. So for those who are into the Arthurian legend, this Gaelic tribe that came, every member of it is the prototype that later was rescripted in the story of King Arthur. Their Merlin was called Avergain. Avergain was the poet, the bard, the one with magical powers that Merlin was based on. The king's sword, which was called Retaliator, became, Excalibur. Their physician turns up in mythologies. Their great king turns up as Hercules and other giants stories in England. And they had a son king. The right-hand man to the king was called Lugh, L-U-G-H. Now listen to this account of the weapon that he had. And again, think about if we heard this 50, 100 years ago, it would have made no sense at all. Old wives' tale. Now that we have the weaponry we have, let's think again. The caption goes, Lugh, he, also had a magic spear, which he had no need to wield himself, for it was alive and thirsted for blood. When battle was near, it was drawn out, then it roared and struggled against its thongs. Fire flashed from it. It tore through and through the ranks of the enemy, never tiring of slaying. There it is, 5,000 years BC. Heat-seeking missile. Doesn't need to be even held. And in fact, I've read accounts where Lugh has to, and it has to be like there's about 9 bodyguard guys. They have to move this thing around, and he's warning them, for God's sake, be careful. Put it back in its spot. There's even descriptions that if you go near it, they had to put all sorts of things over it because it would freak them out. It would destroy their hair and their fingernails would fall out. Same thing we hear about King David in the Ark. Remember where same thing we have Moses going onto the mountain, coming back all bleached white. Same thing we have all over the world about the dangerous weaponry. And there's a whole story in that alone. So from Celtic Ireland to the Mahabharata to the Popol Vuh, you've got accounts of this incredible stuff.
You can't, obviously we're talking about the day and age where this just wouldn't have come out of thin air, so to speak. It was it had to have been introduced.
And remember, that's why I read you that particular caption. Can't we see clearly how even 100 years ago that would have meant nothing to us? About the whole idea of it moving at its own free will. What would we have said about that? We would have said, oh, that's magic. It's a magical story, something moving at its own free will. That would have been put down to magic. Well, my work is very much based on, and why I focus so much on the Celtic stuff, is that because now is finally the time to dig all of this stuff out. They talk about the cauldron of life. Ask anyone who studied Celtic mythology for like 5 minutes, who open a coffee table book on it, and there you will see the cauldron of life. What does the legend say? That the dead or dying heroes will be put inside the cauldron and they'll come out alive. That's what the legends are saying. Well, it makes no sense until you think, wait a minute, could that be some primitive, cryogenic chamber or ozone chamber? We see it in The Day the Earth Stood Still, that famous movie where the guy is dead. He really is dying, but they what does he say? They restore him temporarily to a semblance of life. This once was science fiction. The Celts were talking about it thousands of years ago. And remember, I'm only touching on this. When you get into these tribes in general and talk about
it's hard to cover just the scope of what we're talking about, but to get to the point where we're talking about how technology somehow came about, we really had to talk about it in terms of your research and what you put together. We had to bring everybody up to this
very
point
important
to understand the context of this.
Right. Context is extremely important because you see a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons why we haven't really been sold on a lot of this, because anybody can just jump in at one particular area anecdotally and blow this thing up and go, here you go. And then, of course, we're right not to believe it. In my work, I don't know, maybe it's because of my British background, beginning, middle, and end is very important in this. You have to present the background because doing this anecdotally just will not work, and I actually refuse to do it. It's not something that is just anecdotal like that. This is very, very serious alternative history.
My question at this point is, okay, so we've got these descriptions of horrific events that have been chronicled cross-culturally. There's no argument there. You
no
can't. People want proof. It's there.
It's in the pudding, as they say.
But yeah, proof is in the pudding. But these weapons, this horrible thing happened to the planet. But what happened to these weapons, or why did all of a sudden we're talking about these tremendous magical powers, and then for years or thousands of years
we don't have it,
and then all of a sudden, almost instantaneously, overnight, it seems that here in the 20th century, all of a sudden technology just boom explodes and accelerates at just a colossal rate.
Well, you're talking about something that has puzzled me from the outset when I started to read this. This was on my mind. What we're really talking about is, where did it all go?
Yeah.
So if we're right here and this happened and these kinds of things happen, why do we not have it now? This is what makes my work completely different than every other writer, by the way. For those who are really paying attention to what we're saying, this particular thing you've just said is the difference between Michael Tsarion's work and everybody else. Nobody can account for that. It's very simple. We've already accounted for it, really. The pole shift. The pole shift was not foreseen. The sinking of the continents meant that with it went all of Atlantis, all the citadels, all the spacecrafts, a great deal of the technological hardware. I mean, you've seen Superman in the movie going up north, right? There's a lot of ancient Celtic symbolism in this about going north to Hyperborea. What does he do? He goes into the underground chamber where all his crystal, computers are. That was all destroyed. All this kind of technology, a great deal of it, was destroyed, leaving only a very little left. And I always liken it to the American gunfighter of your frontier days. He takes his gun away from him, he feels what they call naked. I mean, you can have it all up here in the head, but if you don't have your weaponry and your technology, what are you going to do? These individuals were raped of their own technology by their own ferocity, and the Book of Enoch and these things even mention that. Now, here's a very interesting quote. Earlier on, we talked about did the experts believe in this? There's a particular anecdote that involves Oppenheimer. He was the theoretical physicist, remember, and supervising scientist of the Manhattan Project. And he was also very, very skilled in Sanskrit literature. He even read Sanskrit in its original, and he was a very great aficionado of the ancient books. Well, while he was giving a lecture at Rochester University, and I actually met, I think I heard by email the guy who actually asked him this question, so I'm actually in contact with the guy who asked this question. He's a person who's read my book and has been in contact with me. This person got up and asked Dr. or Professor Oppenheimer a very interesting question. He says, was the bomb that you exploded at Alamogordo during the Manhattan Project the first one to be detonated? That's kind of a weird question in the first place, but his answer is even more bizarre. Oppenheimer goes, well, yes, in modern times, of course. Well, do they know something we don't know, And the same thing goes with Professor Hermann Oberth, who's literally, after he was brought to America, the father of space travel theoretics, was very much talking about people from other worlds. Remember we talked about the destruction of the second sun? Another one of the interesting things that you need people to look into is etymology. Why a sun? The word sun comes from the word sol, S-O-L. Sol is the word root of solitary, solo, right, soliloquy, and so on. Sol, which is the name of our sun, means the alone one, the solitary one, implying that at one point it wasn't solitary. Luna, which is the name of our moon, means aluna, alone. That's where the word comes from. The word alone comes from luna. The ancients, after watching the destruction of the second sun, now began to habitually refer to sun and moon as the alone ones. They're missing their cousin. The word that we use for these cataclysms still exists. Disaster means, when we talk about something terrible happening, we say it's a bloody disaster. Dis means to be without. Aster is a star. The destruction of a star. Catastrophe means the same thing. Astrophe meant astra, the star, and kata means to break down. So the breaking down of a star. The word typhoon, which also used to be from the Egyptian the Typhonian beast. Typhoon means the Typhonian serpent, the beast that was unleashed in the skies that caused tremendous trouble. Hurricane. Cane is from the old word meaning serpent, and hurry means to shake, the shaking of the serpent. Even the etymology of our world preserves this stuff. But you're right. There was an unforeseen variable, because after all, look at it, to embellish upon your point, if we're talking about something that happened at very least 11,000 years ago and probably about 13,000 years ago, and we're talking about evil contingents on the earth that want to enslave us and so on, and then we have a rival faction who want to liberate us, well, wait a minute, how come neither of those two scenarios, you see, has then manifested? If the Atlanteans had won, we would be in chains or doing, slaving around. And if the Lemurians' paradigm had worked, then we would all be living pretty much in peace and harmony on a beautiful planet. How come neither of those two things have happened? Because of the unforeseen variable of the pole shift. It changed things totally. And this is why neither side triumphed. All the technological hardware was destroyed. The Atlanteans realized that they basically have to start again. The story goes that the Atlanteans, remnants of them, decide to go to where the new equator is, to the only place that will sustain life all year round, which was Asia Minor. And it's from there, from Asia Minor, from the Euphrates and Tigris area, that the cultures of official history begin. They're based on the Atlantean pattern. That's why they were bloodthirsty. That's why they were agrarian. That's why they were city-state That's why money started to be used. The calendar came into power. Conquest of your neighbors. Blood rituals. All the mayhem of all the modern empires leading up to today are based on a particular pattern that's been hidden what it's really based on. Now, we come back to Zachariah Sitchin, the original point of why I have the major problems with him. It stands to reason. Yes, he's digging up, fine. He's digging up Sumerian Babylonian seals. He's translating them. His scholars are translating them. They're analyzing those. But wait a minute, we got a question now. If these civilizations in the Middle East, in Asia Minor, are patterned on the Atlantean pattern, who writes the history? So yes, Zachariah Sitchin is doing fantastic work reading Akkadian, reading Sumerian, but wait a minute, isn't history always written by the victors? So what the poor guy doesn't realize, because he's starstruck, well, in a way he should be, because what he's discovered is remarkable, but he's made a fundamental error. Of course they're going to push the date of their coming back to 400,000 years ago. Of course they're going to say X, Y, and Z, you see, which is not necessarily true, because they're writing the history. And just because it now looks old and exotic to us, doesn't mean that you forget common sense. These were the tyrants of the world. These are people that you can't just take verbatim what they're saying. You certainly have to cross-reference it with other groups. And that's what my work has done. Now the Lemurians decided to do the opposite. For safety reasons or whatever reason, they decide to split and diverge themselves. They don't converge. They disperse to all corners of the planet. And that is why we have this thing called dispersion. The same rites, the same rituals, the same symbols, the same etymology, the same dances, the same symbolism coming to all parts of the globe. It's a well-known fact. A lot of people can't answer that. It's because it's one group taking it there. One group of the Lemurian high ones and their Adamic wards going to all parts, marrying in with anyone that we might have found as remnants there, which is the old story. Now you got to piece it together. And that's why you have these two sort of things happening. And most importantly, you have the rise of the great, God, the whole idea of the central God, and then the devil, who's going to get your ass. All of this stuff comes out the patriarchal society, the meat diet society. All of these things that are punitive and tyrannical coming out of the Middle East. A very important aspect there. I cover it in the book. And that, of course, brings us up to basically modern times because, not even in my work, I can't track every single event that these individuals have done. But the most important thing to realize is that these guys just don't take no for an answer. The Atlanteans decided to artificially push mankind history forward to the point where they could rebuild the hardware that they had lost.
So everything is being accelerated artificially.
Yeah. And you don't need Gene Roddenberry or Rod Serling, and many more people than them have always lamented. Why is it that our scientific advancement is so far in excess of our emotional and psychological development? This has haunted many thinkers down through time. Well, of course it is. If you're artificially, there's something moving it forward, that's the answer. And it seems preposterous, but it's like Sherlock Holmes said, once you exclude the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Well, we're in the century now for this improbable stuff to come in front of us. It makes a hell of a lot more sense than what we've been handed from the pulpit, what we've been handed from the enclaves of science, who are not that concerned too much with the moral question. And these are things that are besetting us. We need a new science that involves a lot of these researches and discoveries, and many of them are heading the way, like Richard Milton, wrote that book, Shattering the Myths of Darwin, which I recommend. Allen and Dallaire, Flint and Otto Binder. There's many other scientific people that I mentioned whose work I draw upon because, in fact, we cannot understand our modern age. We certainly cannot understand history if we do not understand there's been an unseen hand working to artificially push people forward. This empire of Atlantis, the remnant of it, has spread its tentacles to all parts of the modern world. They wanted the mines, they wanted to get the ores, because this is a humongous job. Now you've got to subjugate the entire planet. You've got to get the ores, the minerals, it's unimaginable. But it still can be done. See, theoretically for them, on paper it could be done. They've probably done it on their own planet, and you don't really have any choice. What are you going to do, sit around, whittling on a piece of wood, or are you going to get with it? Well, these beings got with it. And that's why there's a colonialistic motive coming out of the first of these centuries, and the spread of war and mayhem, and anyone or anything standing in their way. They'd find a way to wipe it out. And the movement of races is very much involved in this as well, because, of course, now that the Earth was in tremendous tumult, you didn't have much choice where you went. You basically went where the geography allowed you to go. So there was a lot of other factors that we need to take into consideration. Now, one point I want to bring up is that the genetic experiments didn't stop either. And this will help clean up a lot of information of people who've been researching David Icke and others who talk about the reptilians. Because, again, one of the most outstanding pieces of disinformation is that a lot of people in this field think that the beings that I'm talking about, the Nephilim, were reptilian or reptilian-like. This is not true. Although they didn't have a lot of their hardware, they had some, and they certainly had a lot of knowledge. So after they set up their bases, their new headquarters in Assyria, Babylon, Sumeria, and what have you, they tried some primitive genetic experiments. And this time they gave up all thought of doing it on humanoids, because that had never worked for them. They thought, look, every time we've tried that, it's gone awry. So they said, well, there's other life forms on the planet. So they started what we would call this other experimentation on the fauna. And they found that the reptile, the DNA of the reptile, worked when it crossed with their alien DNA. And that is the advent of the beings that all mythology also talks about, is the reptilian or the dragon beings. It's also the reason why we have the unicorn, the centaur, the minotaur, the dragon, all sorts of hybrid beings that seems to be that, even though there's been a lot of cover-ups, the sirens of Greek mythology. Up until the Middle Ages is full of this stuff. In fact, we all know the story of the hero who has to go and prove he's a man, or a hero who has to knock on the door of some hybrid like that and fight him. Then you put the symbol on your shield. So this was something that was a done deal in the medieval days. And I believe that these beings still exist, a lot of them. But they were sort of sequestered out after the modern age came in. You couldn't have these beings walking down Main Street. And just like any offspring, some will look more reptilian, scales and all, and some will look perfectly humanoid. And so there's people who have visitations today. There's many accounts of people having seen these beings. Of course, David Icke is the big authority on that right now. And I'd just like to clear up a little bit of his disinformation. They don't come from another planet. They were made here on Earth by beings that once were from other planets. The DNA was crossed with animal life forms.
Wait, could they have really lived that long?
Okay, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, what we're talking about is the lifespan of the originals. No, the answer is no. Even if you think that they may have lived 700 years, there's accounts for that, or 1,000 years, obviously they don't live 11,000 years, right? So yeah, they've died, or they've perished, let's say, the originals, but then they have their descendants. And we all, in a way, are their descendants. Anyone today who carries the Adamic strain, or the Homo Atlantean strain, has the alien DNA. We're lumbered with the schism within ourselves genetically. It brings the immorality we have softly within ourselves every day. We wake up, it's ingrained in us. Will I climb on another person to get ahead? Is it good to steal? Shall I lie? This soft evil that's in us, and then there's the mega evil, the mega death on the social front. So all of that, from the psychological component of the human being all the way up to the physical manifestation of serial killers and mass murderers and what have you on the earth, actually comes from this problem of the DNA. The ancients used to liken it to the two dragons fighting each other, or the two twins in conflict with each other, Mordred and King Arthur, Dylan and Lou, Cain and Abel, Jesus and Lucifer,
Is this also a yin-yang, or?
Yeah. In fact, the yin-yang symbol used to be called the eyes of the serpent, representing the black and white serpents. You have the conflict of, let's think of some of the primordial conflicts. You have, there's so many of them, Horus and Set. The whole idea of the two twins fighting for regency. In fact, there's a poem from the Old Testament when it's meant to be talking about Jacob and Esau, but it works so well. It says, "In your limbs lie nations twain, rival races from their birth. One the mastery shall gain, the younger or the elder reign." So the two dragons in Arthurian legends, they talk about the white dragon and the red dragon in conflict with each other, in perpetual rivalry. And it's the two parts of our own consciousness. It's
which two parts?
The alien proclivity and the humanistic proclivity. Now, of course, conditioning matters too. I think that the idea on Lemuria was that the Lemurians were going to help to condition out these alien genes. They may have even done that with interference on the genetic level, or they may have just done it by conditioning over time to get that out. And some of us are like that. Some people in the world, the Mozarts, Beethovens, Salvador Dali's, whatever, they have that more humanistic side. They're so connected to the universal matrix, so tuned in. And then you get the other side, which is, it's the whole Star Trek, double-sided guy, right? We are these schizoid beings, and because we're schizoid beings, we create a schizogenic society. And we're all laboring under this problem right now, and many people have questioned, what we can really do about it. But there's a historical component to this as well, and that is that we have our history being artificially moved forward. Now, we have a very interesting book called the Emerald Tablets of Hermes, which is another one of the ancient scripts that was, I think, translated by the Medicis Could be wrong there, but certainly it came into the West by way of the Romans. And one of the captions in that book says that, "Speak I of ancient Atlantis, speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows, speak of the coming of the children of shadows. Out of the great deep they were called by the wisdom of the earthman. In the form of man they moved amongst us, but only to sight were they as men. Serpent-headed, when the glamour was lifted, crept they into councils, taking form that were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdoms, taking their form and ruling over man, to destroy man and rule in his place." So the ancient books are talking about deep magic, they're talking about weaponry, they're talking about psychic control, they're talking about mind control, they're talking about evil archies behind government.
So if they had the technology back then, if they had all these abilities back then, they may have lost, certain elements in their cache. But why take however many thousands of years to get us to the point where we are today?
Because it's a slow process. Some of these works talk about that's not a pleasant thing for them. However, some of the works, William Bramley in his book Gods of Eden, and there are several other ancient books like the Annals of the Four Masters, which is one of these old volumes from Ireland, and a few other books like that, actually refer to the fact that during the Renaissance period they'd already built back their spacecrafts. As weird as this sounds, so when we look at those Leonardo da Vinci drawings of the old helicopters and submersibles, that's not just him doodling thinking, oh, tomorrow we'll have all of this. This is him recording what they once had, because he was initiated into these secret societies. He was very much a member of some of these brotherhoods, and he was one of the people that is an official figure. He's one of the people that's above radar level, where we know him as a historical figure, but there are many who were put in charge of this building of this technology. So they were not just doodling and prophesizing for the future. They were people, agents of these secret societies, working on this particular paradigm, as the people behind MIT today and some of these other characters behind some of the scientific institutions are.
Wait a minute.
They're also involved in this.
That sounds so, and obviously this entire show sounds so fringe, because, and maybe it's alternative, if we could use that word, nature. But how... This is where I kind of get lost. I can follow the idea of technology and the concept of as in the cradle of civilization. Suddenly you have a social structure and money, and the concept of a patriarchal society. It had to have come from somewhere. That's the logic side speaking.
Right.
But when you start diving into and start talking about secret societies, whether they're called what's a common term, like Freemasons or
Illuminati or whatever you want to call them,
that's where I'm not quite making that connection, because it just seems to me that maybe I subscribe to the thought on, well, if it happened, or if it's happening, wouldn't we know about it?
Well, we do know about it. See, what the thing is, we do know about it, but that when you study secret societies, it's a very separate, in a way, it's a separate type of research that very few people can make the connection. What you're talking about is a very difficult thing to do, is to try and, first of all, work out what is the alternative history of the world, and then find out how these secret societies operate. Now, I'm trying to find this particular... here it is. In the Book of Enoch, this will help lead into what we're talking about. The artificial movement forward, you have to have custodians for that, and it has to be financed. And also, you have to have a pyramidical hierarchical structure when you're orchestrating all of this. One, because that works very well, and two, you have enemies out there. The Atlanteans have their rivals, so they want to conceal as they're moving this down. They're not just doing it in the open. You have to conceal from your slaves your agenda. So this is where the idea started to happen, where you create cellular, hierarchical, self-enclosed structures, which is basically what the secret society system is. It's a system of decompartmentalization. And the pyramid is the perfect symbol of that, like a hologram or a fractal. Each person working in their cell, just like the CIA operate, just like the triads operate, all of these criminal organizations work in this. The gangs of even New York work on a cellular structure, right? Well, anyway. In the Book of Enoch it says, and Azazel, this is one of the dark angels, Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working with them. And they were led astray and men became corrupt in all their ways. The Welsh talk about it. The Smithsonian also has understood. The Smithsonian Institute and the Bureau of Standards there in Washington have brought to light various objects that prove that 7,000 years ago people were producing steel in furnaces at a temperature of 9,000 degrees centigrade. That's almost like the heat of the sun. This has just recently been proven. Dr. R.V. Dolphin, after studying the Libyan desert glass, he found little, beautifully ornate glass and beads and necklaces. But Dolphin suggested that for the ancient Phoenicians to have worked with temperatures equivalent to 6,000 degrees Celsius, nothing else could make these particular vessels, that they must have known the secret of atomic power. This is one of the top experts in that field. And 6,000 degrees is only 2,000 degrees short of the temperature of the sun. So again, official think tanks, organizations, bastions are discovering this. The word Europe, where do we even get that word? Europe is in Greek mythology, came from the goddess Europa, who was the daughter of the phoenix, which rose from what? The flames of destruction. The very name Europe was given because it's a miracle, right? Just like Ireland was called the Blessed Isles, the Fortunate Isles. Europe is the one who survived the flames, the cataclysm. Now, the secret society thing ties in because these individuals created these orders in order to be fraternal in nature, to have degree ceremonies, so that only initiated people would know what is the top. What is the top? Pick up any Masonic book and look at the 33rd degree, the 32nd, 33rd degree. I go into all of this in the second half of the Atlantis book. It says Prince of the Royal Secret, the Keepers of the Royal Secret, the Prince of the Brazen Serpent. These are the high degrees of Freemasonry. What secret? The secret of genetics, perhaps? Is that the royal secret? Well, the symbolism in Freemasonry shows you exactly that. And in the DVD I have coming out that's a companion of the book, I go into that very deeply. The whole occult history of America is detailed with meticulous detail in that DVD. It's 15 hours long, like we were talking earlier. It's a multi-DVD set. And it goes into the whole concept of the secret societies, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But one thing before I want to leave the old Celtic stuff, I think this is something monumental of importance. We must understand also that there wasn't just this vast technological expertise, there was also this sort of clairvoyant ability. And after one of the great wars in Ireland, the west coast of Ireland, when these demonic forces were fighting with the Sons of Light, the Sons of Light won a particular series of wars about 5,000 years ago. And of course, being a matriarchy, the priestesses at the end, one of the priestesses meant to have gone to the Mourne Mountains to celebrate. The armies went to celebrate the defeat of their enemies, and she gave this prophecy. This prophecy is dated by Charles Squire and other Celtic scholars of 5,000 years ago. That's at least 3,000 and probably more thousand years BC. And here's the prophecy verbatim translated. It says, "Then she," this is the queen, "added a prophecy in which she foretold the approaching end of the divine age, and the coming of a new one in which the summers would be flowerless, the cows milkless, and the women shameless, and men strengthless, in which there would be trees without fruit, and seas without fish, when old men would give false judgments, and legislators would make unjust laws, when warriors would betray one another, and men would be thieves, and there would be no more virtue in the world."
And when was this?
5,000 years BC. Now, you don't even really need to edit that or use too much intelligence to realize what era she was talking about, because that is what you see outside your window every day today. And think that's bad? In the Norse Edda, this is the Scandinavian mythologies, what? Several hundred miles, 1,000 miles, west, in the Teutonic, you have in the Norse Edda almost the same thing. A female high priestess says this, Then she saw wade in heavy streams men, foul murderers, and perjurers, who them other wives seduced to sin, brothers to slay brothers, sisters' children shed each other's blood. Hard is the world, sensual sin grows huge. These are the sword ages, the axe ages, shields are cleft in twain, storm ages, murder ages, till the world falls dead. So something was going on then, and they had prophecy to say, because of this, the genetic, what I believe to be the genetic interference, the fact that these entities are still loose in the world, the Puranas, again, we're dabbling in this, we're just touching on some of this stuff. The word Adam, for instance, has been found out to mean cut off or divided. The word Atlantis literally means from Atlan, which means the broken pillar, the one whose foundations were shattered. So the etymology is very, very key in looking at this. Now, the rise of the secret societies, specifically, one event we can talk about, because again, to track in 11,000 years every single machination of these forces is some task. But something very specific happened in England in the 15th century that I think would answer your point that you made about one of the connections to the secret societies. And this is really going to test people's credulity, or whatever you want to call it.
As if anything to this point
it has not. Yeah. Well, that's
right.
why we're thinking, why not just have the whole pie now, right? Well, what had happened was that, remember I was saying that the pursuers originally of the Nephilim, who had come from wherever, they had made ready to leave quickly. Before they left, they really, even though they didn't have time to scan the planet, they thought that there may be a chance that on Earth here, the Nephilim were still alive and hiding out. So they erected around the Earth a sheath, what might be described as a sort of an etheric membrane. And this energy field of etheric energy, it's technology. It's a high form of technology, but it has probably some other magical etheric qualities to it, is still there. And it acts like a semi-permeable membrane. And what it does is it places the Earth in quarantine. This is exactly how the ancient texts are talking about it. They refer to it as the bottomless pit. And the Native American Indians talk about it as great web in the sky. The Bible refers to it as the sea of glass. I like to refer to it as the Stargate. It's literally a gate. And the moon is its active component. It's like the lodestone around this thing. What it means is that anyone with the alien DNA cannot leave this planet, even if the technology was to be rebuilt. I think that the Nephilim discovered this, or the descendants of the Nephilim discovered this around the 15th century, when they had spacecrafts enough to fly out into our solar system. These were, by the way, observed, and that's why they wrote it down. That's how I know that they had spacecrafts then, because it was recorded by people on Earth. Even in London, they say the king saw it. So these spacecrafts went up there and realized they couldn't get through. When they realized this, and that their own people from their own planet had done this, and that they didn't have the key to get out, they were in a real predicament now, because they'd just spent about 11,000 years trying to build back their technology. They knew, hey, we're making great progress here. But what does this mean? Even if we build all of this technology back, we're chained to the pit, we can't get out. All of the books, including the most ancient ones, talk about this incarceration, quarantine effect. There's so many books that ancient chronicles go into this, but it means that beings could probably still come into our solar system, but it's not possible for those with the alien DNA to leave. And I refer to this gate as the Stargate. And in one of the Gnostic Gospels called the Pistis Sophia, which is a very interesting book to read. Again, it was something that should have been included in the Bible, but was not. They refer to this as a great dragon whose tail is in its mouth. They say in the outer darkness there is a huge dragon whose tail is in its mouth. And it also talks about it in Revelation 8, where they refer to the bottomless pit, and they say, the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven onto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And then in the epistle of Peter, another biblical work, it says, God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto the judgment. So this Stargate is also known in astrology. Those who studied astrology, especially Chinese astrology, know that the Chinese refer to this as the head and tail of the dragon. They call it the dragon's nodes in astrology. And the whole idea in mythology of the dragon encircling something precious. You'll even see jewelry, an artwork of a dragon encircling a globe or a pearl or something of great price. Well, this comes from the idea of an encircling dragon energy encircling the earth itself. You'll see that motif a lot in artwork all over the world. In fact, the symbol of the dragon eating its own tail, which is known as the Ouroboros, is found throughout the planet, throughout all from Mexico, Egypt, India. The Celtic tradition has the encircling dragon. And of course, when we hear about the great hero, where does this whole idea come from, where the hero has to go out and kill the dragon or slay the dragon? Has anybody ever even bothered to ask what on earth that motif would mean, or where it originally came from, and what it's meant to signify? No, we don't. We just accept these things and don't really ask a lot of questions about it. But the fact is, again, that these are cryptic mythological motifs about the breaking through the Stargate and the slaying of the dragon, or the mastery of the dragon.
So they've got to be mad. They can't get out.
That's right. Now, what happened in the 15th century was that after they discovered this, the Tudor dynasty, now the word Tudor comes from tutor. It really meant the teacher dynasty. These were the direct descendants of the bloodline of the Atlanteans. Okay, so there's been many, the Habsburgs, the Merovingians, if anybody who knows that name, the Merovingian dynasties, who were the royal families of France. And then we have the Tudor dynasty of England, are direct bloodline descendants from the Atlanteans of old. They were put in charge of this problem. And the man that they chose to put onto the problem to be the sort of the champion of this discovery of how to break the Stargate problem was known as Sir John Dee. Now, people in the magical tradition who studied the history of magic and the history of astrology will know that name. John Dee was one of the most powerful black magicians in the world, and he worked with an Irish clairvoyant called Edward Kelly. The Queen of England used to get in their boat real late at night and float down the River Thames to John Dee's home, which is called Mortlake. And he had the greatest collection of books, thousands of times more than was in any of the libraries for hundreds of years. He was a very famous man. And one of his jobs, his daytime job, if you want to call it, was he was the ambassador to the court of King James or the court of the Queen. And when he would go and visit foreign dignitaries or be as an ambassador, he'd always write back in the old left-hand writing and the cryptic writing bit, to his queen. But at the bottom of all the documents that John Dee would send back, he would write his code word 007. Okay?
So like a James Bond, so
James
to speak.
Bond is actually the MI5, MI6. Comes from a specific time and event. The Spencer family, which Lady Diana Spencer's forefathers, right? Edmund Spencer, John Dee, who was the original 007. John Dee formed what we know as British intelligence. The first secret society of the world that was a British intelligence was formed by John Dee. He was the leader of it. So when Ian Fleming, who was an initiate into all of this, decides to do something on his retirement, what does he do? Well, he sits down and writes about his own order, his own group, puts it again in front of us as fiction, and a myth is born. But very few people know, and you can actually see these works. I've got the pictures that show you in the DVD I'm producing on this. There's the 007, and if you look at the old MI5 logo, it's exactly the same logo as you have on your American dollar bill, of the Illuminati pyramid with the eye at the top, and the crown of the Queen, she who must be obeyed, the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. Now, so there's a lot. I have a whole chapter on John Dee in the book, and his associates throughout the world. And John Dee discovered that, look, really, if there was meant to be a technological way of breaking through the Stargate, it probably wouldn't happen. He, being a powerful black magician and an occultist, decided on something different. He opened up what is called a portal, a pan-dimensional portal. I know this sounds far-fetched, but this is, I'm not making this up. I'm just a scholar reading this information and piecing it together purely objectively. There are magical principles. He used a system of magic known as Enochian magic, which involves, as you see all those quaint images of the magician standing in his circle and all of that. Again, that's put before us as this quaint, laughable thing, in the encyclopedias of the world, and movies are made. As a matter of fact, why have we never questioned why the symbols in magic are planetary symbols? See, again, there's so many things put in front of us. The symbols of the planets, the symbol of the angels are often planetary symbols. In John Dee's system of magic, he was able to open portals, literally, to other dimensions, to what we would call oversouls, that the magicians or the occultists of the world call the angeli, motivori, the chronocrates. These are oversouls. They don't live on this dimension. They're intelligence for the other dimensions. That doesn't mean they're good. They're of a different dimension. He contacted these individuals, or these beings, let's say, these fourth dimensional entities, to see if they would have an answer to their earthly problem, and he was told that they did. There was solutions to this. They could open the gate in time. And again, this is another one. We've covered lots of events, but I've always tried to point out the one or two most important events, like the first thing that affected Earth history was this genetic hybridization. The next one down the line, I would say, would definitely be the pole shift and the loss of the technology, right? This has been major U-turns in our Earth history. And this one, in the 15th century, needs to go up as one of those all-important, what you might call junctions for Earth history. Dee was told that there were, I mean, he was given volumes of information. They even say that his consciousness was almost like, frazzled, completely wiped out, insane, psychotic because of this stuff that was coming down. And he had to, he had other, people all over the planet, famous magicians in Europe, all working on deciphering this information that came down. But it all centered around two basic premises. One was that these beings that I call the macrobes, I'll explain why in a minute. The macrobes told John Dee that they had to learn how to release energy. They had to learn how to create matter from energy. Right? That was the first premise they were told. The first key to the Stargate concerned creating matter from energy. But that they were so dumb, they were told that we'd have to show you that in 2 stages. So even, point 1 has 2 stages to it. We'll have to show you how to first release energy from matter. Okay? The second key involved the properties of a certain element. And that element was silicon. That's what they were told. Now, a lot of this made sense to them because, of course, remember, they were themselves from other planets and had, at one point, great sophisticated computer technology. But they were being retold this again.
The Chris Pirillo Show is brought to you by Microsoft Windows Media. Download Windows Media Player 10 at Microsoft.com/Windows Media.
Now, in 1945 at Trinity, which is I always thought was an interesting name for it, at the 33rd meridian of the Earth, which is the famous Masonic number, Phase 1, or let's say Phase A of Phase 1, happened on July 16, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped. That was them patting themselves on the back going, well, I think we got Phase 1 halfway completed. We know now how to release from the atom energy. From that date, in 1945, from the 1940s and 50s, they've been moving on the second half of that, of how to create from energy matter. We would call it the nanotechnology stuff that's coming in now, right? We see this plotted through, and the symbolism of these companies tell you exactly what they're doing. So, and the other one was silicon, which is another word for what? When you say silicon, you obviously mean computers. Mm-hmm. So the computer revolution, the computer age, and the symbolism. I have another DVD coming on the symbolism of the world. Are you working with Jordan Maxwell on that one? Yeah, very much. A lot of my stuff is actually even dedicated to Jordan Maxwell because of this. But certainly the occult agenda of the symbolism used, like the Pentium, and there's a whole, people who get the DVD will see this more than we can go into now.
The Pentium.
The term, the name, the symbolism. The Intel uses the serpent symbol if you look at it very closely, and it's a whole other study in itself about the gateway and why certain terms are used and why the 5-pointed star is used and what computers are basically. Yes, they make our life easier and so on, but they were not created for us. They were created by the Pentagon. The Pentagon itself is controlled by the Tudor dynasty of England. The Tudor dynasty hasn't gone anywhere. They just changed their names a little bit. But this force that was behind John Dee are funding the U.S. Pentagon. In fact, the U.S. Pentagon, that shape, was designed by occultists. John Whiteside Parsons, who was a member of a secret society called the OTO, helped in the formation of it. The ceremony of commemoration, the ceremony of opening of the Pentagon was on September 11th. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of, and the layout of Washington D.C. is an entire study in itself. I got a whole chapter in the book on that, about the layout of Washington D.C. and many other cities of the world based on sacred geometry. Because the pact. Why I call them macrobes, these fourth dimensional oversouls that John Dee connected to. The word macrobe is important because it explains this. If we were told before the advent of the microscope that there was all sorts of microscopic life forms, on the head of this pin, on my hand, all around us, we've been taken down to the local street and burned. When the microscope came along, everyone could see, my God, there's an entire ecostructure, whole forms of life, a biosphere that we couldn't see with a physical eye. Well, above the level of the human is the macrobes. These are entities, beings that overlook us. They exist just in the same way as the microbes do, above our level of continuum. The instrument, there is no instrument physically for understanding that they're there, but except the human intuition. The human imagination, the human intuition, and of course clairvoyance know all about what I'm saying. We sometimes get, fleeting glimpses of even ordinary people will sort of get it, but it'll be so, like on drugs, a lot of people, unfortunately, blow open a door to this and go, what the hell is this? Well, a lot of stuff on drugs is this. You are being awakened to this. But of course you don't know what you're seeing, and then you think you're going crazy. But the magicians know all about this, that these oversouls exist. And when John Dee and Sir Francis Bacon and many other people who are involved in this we're told, we're given these instructions. It had the greatest effect for our world because, remember, the microbes do not work for free. They want something in return too in the pact. So John Dee and his cohorts are basically saying, what is it that you want back? And the microbes said that they wanted blood. They wanted ritual sacrifice on the earth. Because blood has certain occult properties. Cortisol, the fear, the energy of adrenaline that's released. This is what these entities feed off. Just in the same way that a local Satanist will skin a cat or sacrifice a frog. Imagine that kind of a ritual taken up to the global level. And imagine the need of these descendants to get off this planet and do whatever they're doing. So John Dee in the 15th century, that's why I'm emphasizing this period of time, put up the entire planet as a blood sacrifice to the microbes for this information. Now, sending people to die in these blood sacrifices is a little problematic. This is also why there's been massive wars, and why certain wars are done at certain places, why soldiers are given occult symbolism to wear, why the centers of war, like the Pentagon and other institutions of war, are designed that way, why the Lockheed uses the five-pointed star, you see? There's a lot of symbolism involved that they're actually showing you that's an occult in nature. Using the five-pointed star involves this. And the symbols of the Maltese cross, the symbol of the pyramid. In your cavalry days in America, they used to use the cross swords and the acorns. Wait a minute, acorns are Druidic symbols. What are they doing on army? What are the oak leaf lapels doing on the German, Russian soldiers? The French wear the oak leaf symbol on their hats. The eagle, the skull and bones that was worn by the British Brunswickers. It was picked up by the Knights Templars. It was used by the Nazis. The eagle has been used by the Romans. There's occult symbolism being used here because ritual death doesn't mean just blowing somebody away and then they're dead. It's very specific. You have to declare the war at a certain time. You have to send those ritual victims to a certain place on the earth. Most of the wars have been conducted at certain places of the power grid at certain specific times. Same thing with assassinations. This particular concept of the blood rituals is very, very important to get into. I talk a lot about it in the book, that there is a reason for the megadeath, for the assassinations that have been happening all over the world. Did you know, for instance, that in Egyptian, the symbol for the star Sirius, because in occult mythology, that star that you see everywhere on the American flag, all over the flags of the world, is actually, and if you read their own works, they'll happy to tell you this, that is a symbol of the star Sirius that they worship. Well, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, if you wanted to write the symbol for the star Sirius, you used three basic shapes. You used an obelisk, which is like a pillar. You used a five-pointed star, and you used an oval. Right? That's the hieroglyphic for the planet, for the star Sirius. What do you find in concrete in Washington, D.C.?
The Washington Monument,
right.
The Oval Office, and the Pentagon.
And the other symbol that's often used was the serpent. And that was the layout of the streets. So why would a city in America, designed by Freemasons, the cornerstone of the monument, the Capitol building, the 7 major structures, if people read about this, they will find that the Masons were involved from point go. The very dropping of the stones was done at sidereal time. There's an immense symbolism used in this. The landing on the moon, the so-called free country didn't know that Buzz Aldrin, half an hour before they set up the American flag and started the cameras rolling, they pulled out a big Masonic banner that had been embroidered by the chief of the Temple of Lodge in Washington, D.C., and did an entire elaborate Masonic ceremony dedicating the moon to the Masonic order first.
No,
absolutely.
How can that be proven?
It's not only proven; it's declassified now. It's fact. Buzz Aldrin admitted it. It's not that. It's not maybe on the radar of the mainstream, but this is documented evidence. You go to their own works, the Library of Congress. This information can be found that I'm talking about is partly covered by David Oveson in his book, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital. By that book, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital will go into an account of that. That's one area where I know this was covered. The idea of even the eagle has landed. What eagle? Well, we associate that with America, but no. The eagle that they're talking about is the double-headed eagle of Freemasonry. It's not the American bald eagle. The eagle that they're talking about, the Freemasons understand, is a different eagle. That's the double-headed eagle of Freemasonry. Okay? The Pentagon itself is if you soften the edges of the Pentagon, it is the symbol of the Tudor rose. There's actually a very similar, if you put the Pentagon and the Tudor rose beside each other, they are very similar in fact.
So
And of course, everyone knows if you put the arms back on a pentagon, it becomes a pentagram, right? A giant pentagram in Washington, D.C., an occult symbol where these engineers of war involve themselves in their vast rituals.
We flew to the moon. I mean, we used technology to fly to the moon. It wasn't great technology compared to today.
I don't believe that. I'm a person who totally does not believe that we ever went to the moon, and that whole thing was completely fictional. It was all.
So you're one who subscribes to the belief that we never landed on the moon.
Right. I think we've landed probes on it, unmanned probes, certainly. I believe we've even gone up there to certain heights. I do believe that, as I've said, that we've had technology and sort of spacecraft type things that can go up there. But landing on the moon in the way that was portrayed to us with these Apollo missions, absolutely not. In fact, I've done a lot of work on that. In the DVD, I cover that on Atlantis, that it's impossible, certainly in the crafts that they've shown us, in the shuttlecrafts with the thin walls, to pass through those radiation belts. I have information on that, and no, I'm convinced, in fact, of it. And there's also been a very long set of tapes. It's at least 4-hour show called What Happened on the Way to the Moon, which is widely available. There's also a book that came out, which is by top scientists, called Dark Moon. It's available. It only came out last year, I think, called Dark Moon. There's a book by a man who worked for NASA called Moon Gate, which goes into it. So I have a whole list of sources that are written by insiders. Again, very people in the highest echelons of the NASA project, who also now confirm. These are whistleblowers, you see, who are...
So then what did then Buzz Aldrin plant the flag on?
You see, these individuals they were imagining that they were there. A lot of these people were under either mind control or they were complicit in this act. Performing the ritual. Now, once you have now presented this act to the world, you have to go through the motions,
sure.
Right? I mean, recently there was even evidence on the web that showed that some of the photography that was taken could not possibly have been on the moon from a photographic standpoint. I mean, this is a whole other subject we're getting into.
Yeah,
I'm not the expert on it, right? But
sure.
There are people who are experts on photography who know that the shadows and the alignments and, the crosshairs just couldn't be factual of the landing on the moon. It's preposterous. And if you start getting into it, you'll find that that's true. The most thing that interests me is the concept of the radiation belts that exist up there. And
you mean around the moon?
Yeah. Before that, the radiation belts of the stratosphere and the ionosphere, to penetrate those in crafts like what we have is not, in fact, possible.
Yeah, but we've filmed flying over the moon.
Hey, we've made, we've also made the movie Stargate and Terminator 2 and all of these incredible movies that you can duplicate anything now. And to imagine that Industrial Light and Magic and Steven Spielberg are the first people to have access to that kind of technology is nonsense.
Okay, so now this is where you're possibly losing me a little bit, because so then has any manned mission outside of the Earth's atmosphere then is not a reality? Is that what you're saying?
I'm thinking that when I've looked into this, I think that they have a way to fly up there to a certain height, but I don't think they're able to penetrate the ionosphere and go up to the moon if they're manned. And that's why I believe there's a lot of emphasis on cloning now, on cyborgs, on virtual reality, of trying to maybe create robotoid beings that can, go and do that. I even believe that, in the paranormal movement, the idea of the little gray, that very famous image of the big bug eyes and and the very slow walking. I actually believe that those are also what I'm talking about. They're maybe semi-organic, but they're actually computeroid. I think they're controlled by people on the Earth. They're put out there for disinformation purposes. And based on the way that they react when they are seen, I believe they're remote control type beings. So I believe there's experimentation in Area 51 to try and make a kind of a hybrid, semi-organic computer type robotoid individual that might be able to go and do certain work in an advanced way on the moon. But nobody has been there. Nobody has been beyond it, because if they had gone to the moon, they would have now gone beyond that. By now, they would have already had a manned mission to Mars, or at least outside the,
Well, so then why was it so exciting for a brief while and then just disappeared? And now you've got
Well, that backs up what I'm talking about, because they haven't done it. It was a scam. They know now that the technology, the alternative technology to prove that it was a scam is too advanced. See, the leading people that were behind the original Apollo missions, it's their work that I'm talking about that is now whistleblowing saying it didn't happen. It's fascinating. And they know now that independent laboratories, independent researchers, even guys like yourselves, can now, through photographic means, prove that it's a lie. So they don't want to reduplicate it again, because it's more easy to prove now that it's bogus. So this has been an elaborate, bogus thing. I mean, Professor Oberth, who was brought here under Operation Paperclip, along with Werner von Braun, right, who was one of the heads of the space program, the creator of SDI, was telling the Americans then, we'll never do it. His own words are saying, it cannot be done. We have tried it in Germany during the Nazis. We had all the money thrown at us in the world. We had the greatest scientists you can imagine. We didn't do it then. We can't do it now. Even if 50, 100 years went by, we cannot do it. They said, yeah, don't ever say that. It's a whole pretense thing we got going here. And assassinations have been committed. You know, I have to stop people doing this. So, yeah, when you're talking about Buzz Aldrin and the act of it, that's ritual. That's different. The ritual act of it is a performance like any actor going and doing a role. You're either mind controlled to do it, or you're in on the game and you're doing it. That's a whole different issue than the factuality of whether it's actually been done or not.
But isn't it easier to say that it was a mind control thing than it is to find a way to prove that what we, in a cultural sense, believe is true isn't?
Yeah, but see, it depends what you mean by easy. Is it easier? To go up against the mainstream is hardly easy. To go against what is the consensus trance of the human race is not easy, in fact. We have to understand how these secret societies work, how they go about their business. Remember, they do plan to leave the Earth. So plan A is to send their own life forms up above. What we're talking about is they want to do it. But when they realize they can't do it, they create dummy programs to get the people to warm up to the idea, oh great, we're going to go out and discover space. Because they know that solar observatories and even your amateur homegrown, what you call, astronomer is going to be looking through his telescope, seeing all of this action. You can't hide it. I mean, you're sending stuff up. So they have to come up with an alternative plan to say, what are we going to say when people all around the world with these damn telescopes they've got, little grandma or little 16-year-old Johnny out there, amateur astronomer, is seeing our crafts go up. We got to have a couple of cover stories. We're going to say that the ones that look like UFOs are, oh, they're not us, they're coming in from outer space. My God, we might be being visited, and create that whole dynamic. Then we got to, when they see other legitimate things like the shuttle that might have been taken off, they go, we can't really hide that. Okay, let's create a fake space program and say, aren't we wonderful? Explore to the moon, get Kennedy to say some numbskull stuff, throw millions of dollars at it, and everyone will just go back to sleep, which is exactly what they've done. Now, under the cover of those stories, they can basically experiment, as they're doing now, semi-openly. The original story was a makeshift fabrication, a Hollywood concoction, actually. And they say that whistleblowing is even done in Diamonds of Forever, the James Bond movies. We've now analyzed who these people are behind the James Bond movies, who Albert Broccoli and these people really served. Well, in a lot of these movies, and that's not the only one, there are many movies that show whistleblowing effects. In fact, in the movie Diamonds Forever, there's a scene in there where they're actually mimicking Werner von Braun, one of the people that he's meant to meet in there. If you know how to decode the movie, they're actually whistleblowing. And one of the characters, there's a head scientist working on the project there for the dark side, the dark secret society, is in fact meant to be Werner von Braun. And there's this whole little dynamic going on there, showing that they're actually a simulated moonscape. And this thing, this thing is a whole facade. In Moonraker, another one of the James Bond movies, in Fifth Element, I mean, the list of Hollywood movies goes on. I'm not in the right mood right now to think of them, but I've got lists of these movies that go into detail about some of the things that are happening, with this program, the space program, that are whistleblowing.
I've seen the movie The Fifth Element many times. How is that whistleblowing?
Well, without looking at it, as I say, I'm not in the right mood to go into it, but I know that movies of that ilk, especially the remakes of a lot of George Lucas stuff, the Star Wars, you see, within these movies are whistleblowing facts. They're given over to us in a certain way, because in ritual, cult ritual, you're meant to tell your enemy, tell your victim what you're doing. It's a game of chess. That's why you have checkerboards in Masonic lodges, because they're playing a game of chess with us. And in that game, in that ritual, there are certain rules that apply, even to secret societies. In fact, the secret societies are entirely ritualistically based, by the way, because that's just the way they are. And one of the rituals is that you must tell your victim or your patsy what you're actually doing. But you can tell them that in a fictional way, sort of hidden in plain sight. And that's what they do through the films like Stargate and The Fifth Element, and other films that, like what was that, Independence Day, which are huge. There's so much secret society symbolism in these films. Enemy of the State. The one I'm thinking of was with Bruce Willis, but certainly they've made Apollo movies. They've made the comet thing, the whole fear, paranoid society bit where you're going to be hit by a comet tomorrow and all this stuff. Utter nonsense, because now there's no Cold War per se. The money has dropped back of funding those programs ostensibly, because remember, the lower rank and file who are not buying into this or don't know anything about the secret agenda, they'd worry and go, wait a minute, why are we still working on this crap? So you need another scare, another fear. Because what we're talking about is at the top of the pyramid there's those in the know, but everyone who works within these fields is not in the know. I do not believe that 99% of the people who work in NASA or in the Pentagon are even aware of this. They are genuine people doing a genuine day's work, thinking that they're protecting their country and whatever they're doing. That's the beauty of this orchestrated system of hierarchy that exists.
So how does it fit in that Japan and China and the United States are all currently talking about traveling to the moon in sometime within the next decade?
Because that's part of the plan. The groups that I'm talking about, these secret societies, are not national. They're transnational. They literally call themselves a trilateral commission. They control all countries. They've controlled Japan for years. They control China. They control communist Russia. Communist Russia was their creation, if you get into it. So China, being a communist country, is controlled by the same bankers from New York, the same hidden hand from England. These guys have owned these countries, by the way. This whole fictional history drama that's been going on for 11,000 years is a concoction. It works somewhat.
Now, some people would argue that China and Japan actually own a large portion of us.
They, in fact, do, and that was always meant to do. The Sony Corporation, which actually stands for Standard Oil of New York, which was owned by J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, moved in. Remember the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki? And
yeah.
They'll even admit that bomb didn't really need to be dropped, but yet it was. Because the plan was to drop it. The plan was to wipe out the economy of rising Japan on its own at that time, so that it would be wiped out, so that the American companies and the people who control the American companies could move in there and create this later to be what we now know to be the so-called rival companies of Japan's economy rivaling America, to create another dialectic, another fear, this divide and rule, the cross and the crown symbolism, which if you study the secret societies, that's how they operate. It's the old checkerboard, double-headed eagle dialectical idea. You create the reds under the beds, and you create the blues. You create the Nazis, and you create the Russians. You create all sorts of divisions. You create Protestantism, but you have to have Catholicism. All down through the years, their own documents will tell you this. My work does not veer away really from anything that is in their own documents that show you how they do it. I've got the quotes from their own henchmen, their own thinkers. They tell you exactly how they're doing this, how they operate. It takes a little bit of study to realize that they do things in a certain way. But that's just like studying any criminal. Once you find out how this criminal operates, all becomes clear.
So what about the Internet then?
Internet was created by the Pentagon, as you know, as the military establishment. And as again, you see, you can, all down through the years, they've put certain things in front of us that we can also use to our own development. After the Second World War, and certainly even after the First World War, but very much after the Second World War, ordinary man that had been their underclass had suffered so much that by now, after the Second World War, there was a worldwide fever of revolution. Man was striking back. In order to offset that, they knew they had to pacify them. Because remember, they are few. We call them hidden and secret because there's a reason for that. They're hidden because they're weak, ultimately. And there's very few of them. So they stay hidden because they don't want people to know about them, because we'd destroy them, we'd wipe them out right away. They're very fearful. When the poor, wretched, soldiers were coming back after seeing their whole villages wiped out, all the deaths and carnage, they weren't going to stand for this oligarchical, you're not going to come back and then see these lords and ladies, in their expensive estates. So the oligarchy of the West knew we're going to have to change the game plan here. Let's offer them some crumbs from our table now. And so it's exactly after the Second World War that you have the rise of the so-called socialist, right, liberal governments and their so-called, welfare plans and, whatever. Yeah, okay, I guess in history we can say fantastic, but you know what that is? That's nothing but crumbs off their table. And one of those things that we were given to pacify dissent, to pacify the possibility of worldwide revolution, was the privilege of education. Just like in the southern states here, when blacks were first let into the universities and the white guys are standing there with their arms crossed going, hey, we don't like this. Think of that anger and that contempt manifested many times with the upper elites of the world, suddenly having to open the oaken doors of Oxford and Cambridge and, Trinity and watch ordinary men and women's daughters farmers, tradesmen, artisans coming into those halls. They didn't like it, but they were told from upstairs, you're going to have to do it, because we will be wiped out otherwise. This mass will rise against us. And then they were also told, don't worry, just because we've opened the doors and physically let these people in, doesn't mean they're going to learn anything. We still are in control of them. We'll still teach them. They'll still ingest whatever, diet of lies. In fact, we may even have more control over them, because now we're offering you a privilege with one hand. What better way to even get complicit people? Now, the internet falls under that category. Certain things that have been beneficial to us, like the privilege of education, like certain amount of expertise with technology. One contingent was very threatened by that, thinking, that's the last thing you want to do is arm them up and let them know. The other side said, don't worry, because we'll hide it in plain sight. And anyway, what are they going to do? Now they're in our fraternities. The universities and colleges are fraternal in nature. They're degree orientated. So if we find anybody who's a little bit too much, they're not going to go anywhere. They went, okay, it'll work. And so it has for the last 50 years. Because if you think back, even your father, maybe even your forefather, never even went to school. That's certainly the case in my country. So we are only beginning to be an opposition, quote unquote, the human race. A lot of people I work with and who write books on this subject are always very pessimistic, thinking, oh my God, these people have been ruling the world for hundreds of years, what are we going to do? We forget that we are only now actually in even the remotest chance of offering forth, a proactive opposition to these forces that have controlled the world.
Proactive opposition to what and how?
To the secret societies and to these oligarchical, plutocratic forces that have governed us from day one.
Well, but how do you oppose opposition if you can't necessarily see the opposition as being there?
Well, that's the whole thing. My work is very much dedicated to identify the enemy. That's the first stage. When you have a pathogenic force in your body, a virus or a disease, you have to there's diagnostics is necessary first. And I'm a big believer in that. My work, a lot of the work of the people in this field, is purely diagnostic. First we identify the enemy and say, here's how it happened. Here's how this infection got into the bloodstream. I mean, you're sick, you're psychotic, you've got all these problems. Our civilization is crumbling, the earth is dying. We've got genocide. We've killed most of the decent races of the world and their great knowledge of how to survive in catastrophic times. We've got the evilest of people running our Federal Reserve and running the money systems and the world banks. Absolute mass murderers, the coldest-blooded psychotics we've got ruling the world. We put them there. They have dumbed us down. We are now constituting, they have given us the privilege of education, and so a few people have used that properly. Not a lot, but a few have become good investigative journalists. They have read the histories of the world that have been hidden from them. They are thinking about really grassroots ways to fight back, and not in the political pigsty that's been designed for you to come in and do that, right? I mean, that's the whole dialectic they've created. There's other ways to do it outside of that, because you don't go into the pigsty they created dialectically. That'll get you nowhere. But again, I refer in my work directly to the horse's mouth, to the great people from even within the secret societies of the world. For instance, let me read you just one quote from the head of the Illuminati, if I can find it here. Yeah. The Illuminati was created in the 1776, same year as America was founded. America was founded July 4th, 1776, but in May 1st, 1776, in Bavaria in Germany, the Illuminati, which is one of the most powerful steering committee secret societies, was created. The leader of it was called Adam Weishaupt. When he passed away, the mantle passed on a couple of generations down until it came to the American Albert Pike. Now, everybody in America needs to know about Albert Pike. He's one of these, again, overworld figures that most people don't know about. We always see the Bushes and the Cheneys and the Roosevelts that are put in front of us. But we don't see those thinkers whose agendas are actually being acted out. Now, in his own work, in a letter to the previous leader of the Illuminati, Albert Pike writes this. He says, "We shall unleash the nihilists and atheists. We shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against a world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate these destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, anxious for an ideal, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer." So these are the Luciferians communicating in letters one to the other, and I've got volumes of this information, literally talking about how they're going to do it. In Zurich, over the headquarters of World Freemasonry, the headquarters of World Freemasonry is in Zurich, Switzerland. If you go to this place, which happens to be right near the World Bank and the human rights courts and whatever. And over the door of the headquarters of World Freemasonry, it says in Latin, Ordo ab chaos, which it means order out of chaos. All Masons know that term. That's exactly what he's talking about. We create the chaos. We create the assassinations and the murder and the paranoid society, and this food's going to kill you, and this virus is on its way, and there's terrorists outside, hiding behind the next tree. And they don't just talk about it, they do it, they create it, they fund it. Bin Laden and all these people are funded by the Carlyle Group, to which Bush and all these people belong to. Every so often they have another, genie out of the bottle that's going to scare everyone. They do this because they're pushing their New World Order. There's many facets of this great movement, and tracking it is an awesome job of how they do this. And they want to get rid of the world states and replace it with what they have right now, which is the coming of this New World Order, because it has to do.
Don't you think, though, and this sidestep technology, don't you think nationalism will get in the way? Nationalism
does get in the way because, again, it means it coming together lots of people. They don't want that. They want separate. They want people to be fighting each other. Divide and conquer, divide and rule. It's the old British game, and they're doing it the same. They refer to it by the term the cross and the crown, the two forms of control that have always kept man in subjugation. The cross, which is religious, mind control, meaning psychological, and then the autocratic. The crown is the autocrat, the boss, the state, the governor, the king, the baron, who tells you you're not going to go 10 miles from your feudal village. Just not so long ago, a man couldn't even get on a horseback and go 10 miles away from where he lived in feudal times. When I'm doing a lot of these talks, people always get up and say rightly, oh, wait a minute now, come on, how can some secret society just come in and take over? It's preposterous. Well, first of all, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about some sort of mafioso / IRA secret society, comes in and takes over. These individuals have been millionaires from the first centuries AD and before. They created the cities. They created the idea. Nothing could have been easier for them. Agricultural man was the most controlled creature you can imagine. The barons and the lords and the abbots and the clerics, they told him what to think and what to do, every move. And that's just recent history. There was no question of it. Nothing could be simpler. And that's why their agenda is unfortunately moving ahead rapidly.
Now, one of the things that I think that you mentioned was the Mayans predicting the end of the world.
Right.
So how does that fit into all of this?
That brings up this interesting stuff about what's coming and why the Mayans were so emphatic about talking about the last 13-year countdown. And for those who don't know, in their calendar, they have an end date where everything just stops. There's no predictions. There's no mention of anything happening after 2012. So people have, sort of questioned, what does that mean?
So, that could mean that everything's over in 7 years?
What I think is it means that the world as we know it is going to sufficiently pass away. Not the world itself. The world that we know it politically, militaristically, sociologically, yes. In fact, we already see... Technologically. We already see that happening. All the saber rattling, the rise of the American empire, the Wolfowitzes and the concept of the neoconservatives. This is all part of this. And if you read their own works, you'll see that they're definitely heading this. They want to subjugate the planet. The secret society control moved from the Europe over to here, to the New World. And then now it's stretching out again to create an empire over there. So yeah, many of the idioms that even our own fathers took for granted are already slipped away long ago. And there's the delinquency amongst the teens, their level of ignorance, for instance, and their just dependency on television, and the rise in pharmaceutical dependency and all of that. It's rampant. So yes, we are heading to a countdown to, some people are calling it countdown to extinction. Other people are calling it, no, it's a countdown to a higher form of awakening once we release ourselves from these pathogenic forces. See, I can't do my work with a pessimistic attitude. I have to believe that, this awareness is because we're about to rid ourselves, with celestial help. There are higher forces in the world, spiritually, that are going to assist in this, but basically it's a human issue. And we're going to find the way to uncover the fact that these individuals exist, that they've been manipulating the flow of history. They still are. They're going to move even faster now. And we are going to find the solution. At the end of the book, tying in with what the Mayans talk about, I speak about 4 possible outcomes.
Yeah, I didn't like... The end of your book was quite depressing, might I add. I'm someone who definitely tries to think positive, and I see technology as a pathway to solution.
So do I. I agree.
Well, and the thing is, if we find out if this is revealed to us, will we care?
See, this is
because we are,
right.
Because we have become a society
of amnesiacs. Yeah.
Well, and we have life is. I think the big reason that television and pharmaceuticals are popular forms of entertainment is because life has become too easy.
You're right. It's the leisure class. It's the class. Is what Gore Vidal calls the culture of amnesia. And and in fact, you're right. We don't care. Some do, some don't. The masses will never care. The masses have never cared. Like, do you remember in the War of Independence, how many people was it in America who stood up against the biggest tyrant of that age? King George III was the biggest tyrant. He had the mercenaries from Germany, from Holland on his back, coming over here to tell your American forefathers just 200 years ago what they're going to do. 3% of this country, stood up and threw him back into the Atlantic Ocean. That's proof positive. What was everybody else doing? Shivering under the bed in fear, waiting for it all to go away. So I'm not one of these new age people who believes, we've got to awaken all our people all the time. That's never going to happen. You don't need to bother about it. People are pretty much not going to get it. They're going to go about their boring life the way they always have. This is an intellectual fight. This is a spiritual fight between agencies, principalities is what the Bible calls it. And it's not, the ending of the book is not pessimistic. What it is, though, is I am very aware in literature and filmmaking or whatever you do not create a happy, cheesy ending so that people roll over and go to sleep. My work ends with a bite. It ends with a cliffhanger because it's very important that people don't think, oh, well, good, after all this story, now we know somebody else is taking care of it. I wanted to leave it with a feeling that, no, the ending is not certain. There's 4 possible outcomes that I can think of after what I've reviewed, but it's very important not to roll over and go to sleep. Each person needs to take personal responsibility. The solutions are in the end of the book, and in the DVDs I go into them with more elaboration about what people can do. Some of that's obvious, which is identify the enemy, collaborate, legally empower yourself, use technology to advance this knowledge, because this is going to happen from the underground. Don't wait for Big Brother to go, hey, tell us all about it. We'll give you millions, let's fund it and own you. No, it's going to be individuals on a grassroots level, just like it was here with the war in Seattle.
Bloggers,
MoveOn.org. They say that there was more hits on MoveOn on the independent channels during the war of Seattle than there was on CNN. That means that people are crying out for alternative information. And again, don't worry about all of the people, all of the time doing anything. It's not going to happen.
There are always going to be people who believe one thing and people who believe another. And you've presented, a tremendous, obviously, I will say fringe, ideas. And my hope in bringing you here was to, talk about specifically and bring to the table the idea that technology just didn't happen. It had to start somewhere. And where did it start? And where were some references? And it's just interesting to hear that there were references that we may not have been able to describe as accurately had we not experienced them firsthand.
And I think that's why I said that even if nobody else, if people find it, and I can understand that sort of skepticism, but one thing is absolutely clear. This technology existed. If you accept that because the records are talking about it in the most verbatim way, most visceral way, then that already presumes that there must have been advanced civilization. See, one thing leads to the other. And I am a person who's really researched this, not just from the mythological side, but from the scientific side. Some of the leading scientists, they're all sourced in my book and on the website. You'll be amazed at what has been discovered, what continues to be discovered. They've just discovered the little people. Just as after Lord of the Rings came out, there's these worldwide discoveries of these hobbit-type beings, you see. That we are now in the age when several things are going to happen. We're in a solution age. So some of this is going to be less preposterous. What's going to happen also, we're going to find solutions, and we're going to have a lot of the secrets of the human race being slowly uncovered.
Now, let me ask you this. It was kind of odd. I find it's a fascination with the idea that, there is life on other planets, whether it's, simple life or advanced forms of life. What's your take on Dan Rather coming out and doing that UFO special? Wasn't it Dan?
No, it was Ted Koppel. Peter Jennings. One of those. They're all the same.
They're all the same. Peter Jennings coming out and doing that UFO special a few weeks ago.
I didn't really track it because I was doing some other interviews and I'm trying to work on a second book. So I didn't really follow it. And I've learned, you see, to not pay too much attention to this double-speak Orwellian crap that they put out there to pacify people. I'm so sick of that double talk. I'm glad that something's out there better than nothing. There have been Discovery Channel programs on some of the stuff that we've been talking about. Eric von Daniken has finally been vindicated, and the guy's got his own specials on TV, sometimes hour length. Fantastic. Happy to hear that. Graham Hancock, who's a great English scholar, who's very much, his new book Talisman is a classic. It's inching forward slowly, and the reason why it is because people are just not buying into what they've been told. There's just not enough, and some very important people in Hollywood, and even other thinkers and free thinkers in America, even the intellectual set, are starting to wake up. You'd be amazed at the books that are written by people, and you'd read. These are people from, like Robert Sterling, who wrote the book Shattering the Myths of Darwin, was the Observer newspaper, scientific correspondent. I mean, this is top-notch people. If you read his preface and you didn't say who it was, you'd think that this was a fringe person hammering the system. He's so fed up, you see, with the way it's done from the Royal Academy and the Royal Society and the lies that these people have told, the Darwinian fallacies that have been put before us by the Royal Society. But then you have to find out who the Royal Society was. The Royal Society came from the Lunar Society of Erasmus Darwin, which was a secret society. That was connected to the Hellfire Club. So, a lot of the think tanks that are put before us today, why does the Smithsonian Institute use a black sun as their symbol? Who created it was actually oligarchical forces from Europe that created your Smithsonian Institute here. The kings of the world were involved in its founding. So, there's a lot of stuff we need to understand. For instance, here's a very famous quote from Ronald Reagan. This was at the United Nations. He said, if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet, we'd forget about the little local differences that we have between our two countries, and we would find out once and for all that we're really all human beings on this earth. That's a very famous quote. It's on many videos and talks, right?
I've heard it.
But what they do not tell you is the last couple of lines. That speech goes on to say, and yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? There are only a handful of people who know the truth about this. And that was Ronald Reagan to a full session of the United Nations on September 21st, 1987. Yet I ask you, is not an alien force already amongst us? There are only a handful of people who know the truth about this. Now, wait a minute. But that's right. Gorbachev let it slip through his translator that, he was a member of a secret society, and that everything that he's doing, perestroika, was endorsed by a secret society. They edited that, but it already came out. The alternative guys got hold of it. He mentioned that order by name. Ronald Reagan has made various slips. So then out comes, whoever, Dan Rather, whatever, put something forward. We observe it all, because some of it's disinformation, some of it's not. At the beginning of the movie Highlander, because what I'm talking about has been put there before you, but it's been put in a right-brain way, hidden in plain view, so we don't connect the dots. When you hear Sean Connery's voice at the beginning of the first Highlander movie, he says something fascinating. He says, from the dawn of time we came. Get out this movie and you'll hear this over voice. It says, from the dawn of time we came, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives. No one has ever known we were among you till now. Remember I was talking about the whistleblowing? Mm-hmm. That movie, its subsequent follow-ups, the George Lucas movies. These movies contain information, memes, that are then transposed into our unconscious mind. They're not meant to be, communicated consciously to the popcorn eater, but they're meant to be translated as meta-themes to the mind. Now, that's what I work on. People can argue about little specifics here and there. I couldn't care less about that, and I usually don't waste my time about it.
Well,
so dealing with the meta-themes is the most important thing to grasp.
You bring up, you use the word meme, and I think the blogging world in general understands that term, and they use it quite often. Of course, marketers would know it better as viral.
And that's a good word.
It's what it has been defined as. How do you think bloggers have played or can play, or maybe you've just begun to play a role in the media?
Okay, as an astrologer, I'm all for it, and I think it is the way of the future. In the book of Revelation, when it talks about, now this is astrology, so again, I always put that in parentheses for people who don't know, but in astrology, there's something very important to do with the internet. In the book of Revelation, when John is talking about the Battle of Armageddon, the ultimate fight, the end of the fight between these forces, he says that the Battle of Armageddon will be fought in the air. And it just sort of leaves that, in the air. What the hell does that mean? Well, many people have translated it. In astrology, when you use astrology to translate the Bible, air means air signs. There's fire signs, water signs, air signs, and earth signs. Now, the air signs are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Taken together, and we're meant to be moving into the age of Aquarius, the air sign. Aquarius rules advanced technology, cutting-edge approaches, innovation, and grassroots approaches. This is what the air sign Aquarius represents. So I believe that the internet is one of the ways that this Battle of Armageddon is going to be fought. If you just
online, are you?
Right.
You're not talking like EverQuest or something like.
I'm being graphic about it, and I'm purposely being, fictional about it.
Sure.
What I'm saying is you connect these. In my understanding, what is really being implied there, if you want to stretch the point, is that the Battle of Armageddon, this fight, which is an intellectual fight, by the way. See, it's not a fight of physical swords. And that used to be maybe hundreds of years ago on the battlefield. You'd meet your enemy, and there you have it. It's completely different today. It's an intellectual battle of spiritual understanding. The internet is an extension of the cerebrum. There's no doubt about that. If you get into the metaphysics of what the internet constitutes and the electromagnetics that involves it and the digital space and the fact that it's basically a magical thing.
Yeah, it's nothing there.
God, there's nothing there, right? And the energy that gives it birth. And some of the symbolism it's used, like the triple W, which is the wave of Aquarius. You'll find a lot of Aquarian, Uranian symbolism. But the most important thing is what's it for? Yes, it was handed to us again by the dark side. But this is just one of the ways that they do it. They kind of arm us up to see what these guys are going to do with this. A great deal can be done with it. Webcams, live stuff, conferencing, fact information, real time, transmittance of energy.
Live streams of audio.
Right, exactly. And I'm very much into it. In fact, my work could not be done without the computer, period. Now, the one thing I'll add, because there's what we call, when you deal with the astrological aspect, yes, you hear a lot about Uranus in relationship to the computer, but there's also a Piscean element ruled by the planet Neptune, and a lot of people haven't been able to decode what that is. I think it's to do with the third world. This contingent or demographic that we laughingly call the third world out there is the keeper of the kind of lost traditions that the West has lost. They've been disenfranchised, marginalized, and everyone just goes, well, that's a third world, isn't it? First of all, we don't even ask who came up with the terms first, second, and third world. I mean, we certainly didn't. Who would even think of the world in terms
Actually,
like that?
What is the second world? Because there really is
what is the second world? Well, see, the first world is them. We are the second world. The first world is the elites who come up with these ludicrous Masonic terms. 3 is very important in life. The third world are those we can deal with. The Trilateral Commission, those whose pyramid is over the earth, right? If you count the circles or the compartments of the the NATO symbol, the United Nations symbol, you'll see it's 33 sections of the grid that you'll see at the 33rd degree. These are Freemasonic symbols. Now these guys think of the third world. The third world is our salvation. But the third world, from a normal media point of view, has been completely disenfranchised and has really hardly any way of interacting with us, the Western youth or the Western mind, except for what? This.
Yeah, the internet.
Very soon, and it's already happening, on their little bicycles in Taiwan, they got the freaking computer up there on the handlebars. They have it in their own cafes now. It's becoming big. I am very much looking to that because I saw it before from an astrologer point of view. It's been predicted by many clairvoyants that this computer, look at Tiananmen Square. When there was the communists locked down all the information, the normal portals of communication, they forgot this, and some guys were like hitting the Western newspapers and corresponding with Western journalists live, real time, and the government there didn't think about it. A big Leviathan like that didn't remember that people are and now you have miniature computers, iPods, all sorts of things going on. When we hook up to satellites and have other aspects, and the Wi-Fi is a really good invention, and there is a potential there. Let's just put it that way, of total independence. And even when you're not that far yet, you still have the chance of communicating vast amount of brilliant information. And I believe that when the third world gets online, as we say, it's going to matter more than all the dudes in the West sitting home shopping on eBay. That's not a really good use of the internet. We're in certainly early stages of the Uranian part of it, where it's just like, hey, great, Remember when the train tracks, when Louis Stevenson, when they were finding out about trains, when they were first making the steam trains, the problem was that all the tracks were of different gauges. So they came up with a problem. They had to have a standard gauge. We're in that early stage now where it's like, hey, this is great. But it's just like, boom, you've got just so much stuff, overkill. It's the old Uranian paradigm.
Yeah.
Eventually, some type of Saturnian order is going to come into this, which will help. And I believe then you're going to see this other phenomena. And I really do, this is my final sort of last prediction. I believe that the West is going to meet the East. That means those guys over there in the East who are still the poets, still close to their culture, still know how to make a basket and tie a knot, and still know how to dig an artesian well, all the things we forgot. We're going to be able to get back in touch with those people who haven't forgotten all this. They're about to come on board. There's also going to be prevention of that. which is why some places like Sudan and others are being tyrannized, and the World Bank is going to try and make sure that that doesn't happen, but it will. From the Far East, from these outranged places, from certainly South America, you're going to be able to open portals. They're going to have their own websites. They're going to be visiting our websites. There's going to be a huge inclusion coming of the third world. It's going to move up through the internet to be the first world again. That's going to do what? It's going to enrich and empower, and even a better word, it's going to really, it's even inspire and enrich is too weak. It's going to be much more physical than that. It's going to be, like permaculture, things that we really need to know, that we kind of lost the secrets. And why reinvent the wheel? These characters know how to do it. There's going to be a linking of East versus West by way of the internet.
Michael, you've spent 3 hours and carried the show quite well. Yes, some people might say, well, you didn't really talk about technology, but I beg to differ.
Well, I think we did.
I think we
talked about a kind of technology.
Yeah, and really the impact of technology throughout the ages, as well as possibly where it came from. So again, Michael Tsarion was the guest here on the Chris Pirillo Show, and if you want to find out more about Michael and what he does, I'd suggest swinging by his particular website, taroscopes.com. TAROSCOPES.com. Atlantis, Alien Visitation, and Genetic Manipulation is the name of his book.
I have a phone number too. If people
sure, go ahead.
It's Seattle 206-527-2968. That's 527-2968. And there's an Atlantis page on the website. There's a lot of information there on the links page. People are welcome to give me comments.
Yeah.
Or send me information. A lot of people send me information.
Oh.
Again, collaboration. I know a lot about what I do because people who are in the field send me their own discoveries and findings.
That's very cool. Well, Michael, I have read the book. I can say that with honesty. It's not just lip service. I've read it, and as has Ponzi. I don't know if she got as far as I did, but it was intriguing and quite causing me to think about things differently. And that's anytime, whether I believe it or not, it's always good to challenge that which I thought was true.
It's very important
every case
to get your arms around as much information as you can before you make a decision. The first job is to get your arms around as much of the information regarding a subject that's out there. That's just what I've done, is to provide some of this old, ancient information in a new light. It's all been there before. It's just presented in a new light. Again,
Michael Tsarion, Atlantis, Alien Visitation, and Genetic Manipulation. Check it out, seriously. Even if you think all this talk was just crazy, it wasn't. Just take a read and then decide whether or not you want to learn more.